Welcome back to Homer Bound, a podcast where a couple of nerds read through and discuss Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I am Llama.
And I am Wriste.
And today we're welcoming yet another lovely guest with us. We have Scott Rubin.
Hello.
Hello, Scott.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Do you want to tell us a little
soon.
bit?
I'm so excited. I just can't hold it in.
I mean, glad to be here, rather. Like, I don't know. We'll see. We shall see.
How
by
dare
the end
you,
of...
Wriste? How dare you?
I'm still...
At least I am lovely to be around, okay? We've already established this with Courtney, who we had on last time.
Scott wasn't here for the last episode, of course, but that was like a fever dream.
Chaos.
It was a fever dream and a nightmare and a weird blurry memory that I have that I'm not even sure it actually happened.
I know.
But,
so when I took over emceeing duties, I joked that this would be the listeners' welcome to chaos, and I think we accomplished that in such a beautiful way with our last episode, which was absolute pure chaos, and I loved it.
Well, that's great. That's beautiful.
In any case, why don't you tell us how you came to be here with these two mega nerds talking about the Odyssey?
Sure. Well, it's a long tale, so should I start in the beginning? In the beginning. I'll give you a very brief background for me. My background is I went to school for many, many years studying the classics. I even got a master's in it. So yes, I've read all of this in the original Greek. My master's was in classics with an emphasis in ancient Latin. So I did all of that kind of stuff and then promptly dropped out of academia forever. Went and did all sorts of other crazy things. More recently, I have a book that's out, Naming Your Little Geek. You can find that wherever books are sold. And then I've been doing solo streaming for a while, and part of that has been getting back into mythology and sort of doing mythology streams, talking about Greek mythology, Roman, Norse, sort of all the stuff that I studied and know about. And then when I saw the news about the Iliad reading project that Wriste had put together, I thought it was so cool. I sent him an email about it, and we talked, and he said, hey, we've got this podcast, and maybe you'd be interested in doing it, and I jumped on board.
Amazing, and I admire your bravery in doing that.
He didn't know anything about me.
Well, any chance I get to talk about how awful Odysseus is, I will take it.
So I'm super excited for that, and thank you again for joining us. So before we get started, I will jump really quickly into our little content warning that we do at the beginning of every episode. We are
Almost
immature. Many of the episodes. We are immature little geek children who curse. I have a potty mouth, and so does Wriste at times. And so, yeah, let those curse words fly, Scott. Feel no hesitation. We do try and keep things, somewhat classy, but we're no strangers to adult language. In addition to that, the Odyssey has some adult themes, violence, gore, death, and a little bit of bound chicka wow wow hugging and kissing. So that is all things to be warned about. So as I always say, listener, proceed at your own risk. But I hope you join us for another fun episode, and because I think this is going to be a good one. These chapters are really, really good.
Can I throw in real quick?
Yeah.
There was a very specific reason why. Let's see. I can't remember, Scott. Did I propose this book specifically to you?
Well, actually, you let me have free reign of choice of books, and it was very hard. It was very hard to choose because, of course, the Polyphemus chapter is the most famous, and I thought really hard about doing that one, but I was like, no, I really love Book 11, and there's so much to talk about in it.
Yeah, it's actually super serendipitous because one of the books that was giving me trouble was this one, Book 11, which is super weird, at least for me, without context or whatever. It's for me, it was very similar to book 18 in the Iliad, where we have Achilles' crazy shield, and having someone on to explain that to us was like a godsend.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, that episode, I think, still continues to be the one that has blown my mind the most. So we're very excited to have you on, because
you can be our Virgil.
Cool.
One of these, this is absolutely one of these books where like there is a lot going on.
Yes.
And a lot of like really intense imagery and ritual, and it's so cool, but I, like Wriste, I think am a little flummoxed by it at parts.
Yeah, and this is sort of when I talk about, especially the ancient epic poems, I always like to say, look, audiences who are listening to this in the ancient world, they knew all of these stories. So the poet could drop in the most minor reference and they would know what that story was. So it's not always in here for us to read about. So if you don't know that reference, yeah, you got to go look it up or have someone tell you, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, kind of like how you're expected to know like the judgment of Paris going into the Iliad. It's like why would you have to explain it? Because it's just so commonplace, I guess.
So speaking of knowing the background of stories and whatnot, I'm going to just go into a little quick recap of what we went over last time before we get truly into things. So we finally have gotten to the point where Odysseus is telling his story to Arete and Alcinous. He has told us about the sacking of Cicones, about Zeus's typhoon that he sent. We've heard the really famous story of the Cyclops and his scheme to escape by calling himself No Man and tying his men to the sheep, and all of them, wandering off, Poseidon vowing to absolutely fuck his shit up. And then we have also...
Because he couldn't just leave it alone and sail away. No. He had to tell him, it was I, Odysseus, who did this.
Yeah.
Jerk.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they leave, they go to Aeolus's island, who gives them the as Courtney called it, the fart bag. The bag of all of these winds, which they of course foolishly squander, and when they go back to ask for help, they are refused, and then they go to the giant's island where a bunch of people get eaten. They run away yet again. This is all very kind of like that cartoon montage in Monty Python where they're going through the cave of Arg, and and there was much rejoicing, and then they're running away from the multi-eyed beast. They reach Circe's island. They find her singing at her house. She drugs all of his men, turns them into pigs, and then of course when Odysseus goes to confront her, he is told to take this antidote and then sleep with her. He does that. She frees his men, and they stay at her house for a year. And she tells him that he must now go down into the underworld, see Hades and Persephone, and get advice from Tiresias, the poet. The prophet.
I don't think they're going to specifically chat up Hades and Persephone. That's just kind of where they live, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of interchangeability between Hades the name and Hades the place, and especially in different translations, for sure.
I will say, just to I guess reiterate what some of what I said in the last episode, I guess partially for your benefit, Scott, and of course for the benefit of the listener. One of the questions that, of course, we're prompted to ask ourselves is, especially when someone's telling you something, is how truthful are they being? We have a mini example of that with Odysseus and Nausicaa, where we know what happened, and then we know what he tells the king and queen, which is mostly true, but some omissions, and he's very good about those sorts of things, which is what makes reading those last two books and this next book very interesting, because now we don't know exactly what happened, aside from the thing with Calypso, but now we're sort of left to wonder how much, what is Odysseus leaving out? And one of the things that interested me about these last two books in particular is that Odysseus includes fairly damning things about himself, which doesn't seem terribly characteristic of what we would expect of someone like Odysseus. which to me is almost evidence that I don't know if he's tailoring this tale as closely as he otherwise would, like with say something more pre-planned, like his story with Nausicaa.
Yeah, actually, my first note for today is keep in mind this is all Odysseus telling the story to the Phaeacians. He's an unreliable narrator, and he still admits his weaknesses and failures. And that ties into what we'll talk about when we get into all of the references that we see in Book 11. But the transition between the last couple books and these books, a lot of people look at as sort of a transition between the Iliadic ideal of a hero and the Odyssey ideal of a hero. That we're switching. Odysseus is fallible. He does screw up. He does get his men killed. He has to find heroism in different ways than just battle glory.
One thing that I found also, I guess, compelling about the fact that Odysseus is even telling this is that he's probably never told this before. And viewing it from, like, how, like, when something really bad happens and, like, you finally get to tell it to someone, like your therapist or a loved one or a friend or something like that. And that sort of outpouring is relieving. And Odysseus has had a lot of trauma, obviously. He's been through a lot. And the only people that he might be able to tell it to are the people who are doing it to him or dead or something like that.
It's his first opportunity for catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm unsure, like, how... Like, I don't know if this is, like a good reading of it, but that's how I'm sort of viewing it now, and it partially serves to explain why he's not being, or it doesn't seem like he's being as crafty or tricky or whatever with his language, which is that this seems like a fairly earnest telling, obviously taking into account the fact that we try to protect our egos and our egos try to protect us, and maybe he's omitted some particularly bad things, but we don't know what those are.
Yeah, I was saying last time, like, how to me it really feels in a lot of ways like this is one of those things where you start telling a story, but it's really emotional and personal to you, and by the time you get done with it, you realize, like, oh god, I just told them, like, all of this really embarrassing stuff. But, like, when you are talking, it just pours out of you. You really can't hold back. You really can't have that same type of restraint that if, you were the witty, cunning Odysseus that you might usually have. It's just like you've been through this ordeal and now you're in a place of safety for, like, the first time in God knows how long. Because even when he is spending these extended periods of time on Circe and Calypso's islands, he's not really safe. He's in a vulnerable position. There is an uneven power dynamic between them.
Yeah, his chance to unload and get all of this off of his chest. Yeah, and then we'll talk too. Just a brief foreshadowing, but in Book 11, when the narrative does break and he talks directly to the Phaeacians, so we'll talk about what that means and what that could.
Just for the record, I think Wriste is always saying, like, well, before we get ahead of ourselves, and then we continuously get ahead of ourselves. So
okay.
I personally have just kind of dispensed with that, and it's like, you know what, we'll just bounce around a little bit, because that just always happens.
Before we get into it too much further, I did want to ask a question. When on this podcast, when you deal with the pronunciation of names, how have you been proceeding?
Poorly.
Okay.
For me. No, I'm kidding. I think we've been consulting the glossary for the most part when we can, and then sometimes I'll just look down at a name and be like, this is how this is pronounced in my head, so I'm going with it.
Sure.
And also, like, with our time having done the audiobook with the Iliad, at least for me, I got a chance to engage with a system of pronouncing these names, and so that's kind of what I go with, and it makes things a little bit easier.
Cool. Because I personally, since I was in academia, I've had a huge change and an evolution in my thinking as far as pronunciation, and pronunciation guides, total bullshit. If you and I know who we're talking about and you're pronouncing the name completely different than I am, doesn't matter. It's all good.
I like you already. I like you a whole lot already.
we're all telling the same stories. We're talking about the same characters. It doesn't matter. Because again, depending on what translation or what what history you're going from. Like if you learn it from Latin sources, if you learn it from this translation, it's going to be different, and it doesn't matter. It's all good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm down with it. Like, but the biggest thing for me was Menelaus and Dr. Daniel. He pronounces it Menelaus.
Sure.
Which has come to grow on me. I'll also pronounce it Menelaus, but stuff like that, I can deal with it.
I have to I hate to admit it, or not really hate to admit it, because I don't really care all that much, but Patroclus has been growing on me a whole lot. I was going for Patroclus, which is also, equally valid,
sure.
But like Patroclus has been growing on me. It has taken me a while because there's the scene in Troy, which I assume you've seen Troy.
Unfortunately.
And right, there's that scene where Brad Pitt, is looking for him and he's dead already, and it's just so funny seeing Brad Pitt come out of that tent and go, Patroclus, Patroclus, and I was cracking up, and so that pronunciation at first for me was just like really silly, but now like using it in a more serious, context that isn't Brad Pitt related,
yeah,
it's grown on me significantly.
Well, I will say I do like Patroclus more just because I think it has more of a rhythmic peak and valley to it, I guess. The emphasis is in the middle, so it feels more.
So for you, that emphasis would be on the correct syllable.
Yes,
exactly.
On that note, however, let's get into this because I'm super excited. We will start where we kind of ended. Cersei has told these people that they kind of need to make their way to this specific area of the ocean to gain access to the realm, I guess, of Hades and Persephone. And so they go there, and in order to kind of gain access, they have to engage in these like solemn rituals.
Yes. So I would say that Book 11 has a lot of what I call... So first we have the idea of traveling to mythical places, right? The first place they go is the land of the Cimmerians, which depending on how much of a Conan fan you are might mean something different to you. But then there's an idea in literature beyond the Odyssey, and I won't talk about this too much, but the idea that a great hero at some point has to confront death, has to die and be resurrected. So this is Odysseus' chance. He goes down into the underworld, he dies, and then he comes back, so he comes back to life. And also, we see throughout Book 11 all kinds of sacrifices, but also things that really appear to be what we would call magic rituals and symbolism.
Yeah, definitely. And like one of those that I want to talk about is, so he takes this like pure black sheep, and cuts his throat, and black blood comes out, and this kind of serves as like, and I don't know if I'm imagining this correctly, it almost kind of like forms like a barrier around Odysseus and forms this kind of between world where he can communicate with the dead. Am I interpreting that like at least somewhat decently?
Yeah, so essentially it's okay, so now Cersei, for all intents and purposes, she is a witch, right? She is like a prototypical Western idea of a witch. She has a magic wand, she has potions, she casts spells. Like everything that we think of as witches, you can kind of trace back to her and Medea, which is also really interesting. And so yeah, she essentially gives them this magic ritual to perform. They do sacrifices, which is again more of the religious stuff. But there's all this weird with blood magic, essentially. They dig this giant pit, they fill it with blood. Odysseus has to fend off the shades so that they can't drink the blood to talk to him until he says they can. It's like, it's very magical and mystical, for sure.
I would say what was weird about him fending off the shades, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I remember him, if this was with his mother, he wanted to like embrace her or something, but he couldn't because obviously she's a shade. I think that's what happened, but if that's true and the shades are like, immaterial, how is he fending them off? Like, what is he doing?
Yeah, and again,
it's a spiritual barrier.
Yeah, I mean, he literally, we read repeatedly that that Odysseus grabs his sword and he's sort of waving his sword around. So yeah, there is this sort of idea of how much, the way I look at it is, how much do these shades understand about their position? Because we hear a lot in the Odyssey and in other places that for the ancient Greeks, the underworld was not a good place to go. You were essentially, and you've seen this in Hades, when all of the sort of the minor dead are just floating around. They're just like little mindless creatures with no faces and no way to speak even. So
for Hades, do you mean the video game?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We have 3 different iterations of Hades.
Of course. Yeah. For sure. So yeah. So
keep growing.
For the average Greek, if you weren't a great hero and you didn't accomplish some great thing, you would go down the underworld and you'd just be this mindless, lifeless shade that would just float around forever. It was only great heroes or somebody who accomplished something that you'd be able to keep your vitality in the underworld. So there's this question of, do these souls really understand where they are and what their situation is? Could they have just run up or floated up and drank from the blood had Odysseus not, tried to fend them off? Who knows?
For me, this was like vaguely, I guess, or maybe it wasn't even present in the Iliad, but in the Odyssey especially, and this is something I've been harping on for the last for basically all the episodes, which is that solutions to problems or things in general shouldn't work logistically. Like for instance, Penelope's shroud that she used to trick the suitors for 3 years. Like the others have said, maybe the suitors didn't know anything about weaving, and so but it's like, if you have eyeballs, you can probably see that this shroud is not getting any larger.
That's not what I've been saying, though. What I've been saying is not that they don't. It's not necessarily that they don't know anything about weaving. It's that they don't care about women's shit. They don't care to look into it all that much because they're just like, oh, she's weaving, she's doing her woman thing,
and
that is different to not knowing what it is.
Yeah, well, and as I've said, if this was just like this one instance of this sort of thing, then I could probably buy into that. But there are so many things that just seem like they just work. And what's important is that they are suggesting or providing an avenue by which a character is a certain way, like Penelope is clever, or when Menelaus holds on to the sea god, it's like, that's such a weird solution to this problem. Like, how do you capture him? You just hold on to him. Like even
those I completely agree with you.
Or even with Polyphemus, like saying his name is No Man. Like if Polyphemus doesn't seem stupid, like he could probably figure out that he's been duped. They were talking about how like maybe he was drunk, right? But like all this sort of stuff, like this seems like just another one of those things where like it doesn't matter how Odysseus has actually fended them off. It's just a matter of fact that he has, and he used his sword, and it doesn't really matter if like so getting into, at least by my perspective, getting into the hows and the nitty-gritty, like I mean, I guess I asked the question, but I'm also answering it with it doesn't seem like it matters too much. What's important is that he does do it.
Yeah, and that Odysseus is the active force. He's accessing the underworld. He is choosing who gets to speak to him, choosing where and how he gets knowledge. Because the whole point of this adventure is to get information. And so that's another sort of through line we can look at in this book is who has knowledge, how much, and what does Odysseus have to do to get it? Because there's also there's a big disparity in how this blood magic actually works. Because he knows, going into this, Odysseus knows, and he says that he has to keep the shades away from the blood until Tiresias comes to talk to Tiresias. But then, and Llama, I think you said like the idea that this feels like a horror movie, for sure. We have this crazy blood sacrifice, and then the shades start appearing, and we have this like progression of women who died early and old men, like just all this sort of setting the scene. But then all of a sudden the first shade that comes out of the gloom is Elpenor, his buddy, who he didn't even know was dead.
Yeah, so like let's rewind just a tiny bit to
Sure.
book 10, because what happens at the end of book 10, which we talked about, which I was one of my major like what the fuck moments, is Elpenor gets drunk and is up on the roof of like Cersei's house and just forgets that there's a ladder, falls down and breaks his neck and dies, and he goes to Hades. And I saw this as kind of almost the string that ties that book to the next book, because he's the first person that you see after this blood ritual is carried out. He pops up and he's like, yo, can you bury me?
Yeah, and in traditional stories, and especially ones that relate to more of the mysticism and the magic elements, there has to be a sacrifice in order to get to the land of the dead. So Elpenor literally is the sacrifice that allows Odysseus to go there, and Elpenor's in this weird interim state. He's dead, but he's not buried. So again, that gives Odysseus access, but then he knows he has to come back and bury him at the end of this adventure. But when he does meet Elpenor, Elpenor doesn't drink the blood, and he just tells Odysseus a bunch of stuff that he knows back from when he was alive. And it's like, well, how does that work with needing to drink the blood? And then Tiresias even comes up, and Tiresias talks a little bit before he drinks the blood, and then it's like, well, what's
it's maddeningly inconsistent,
Yeah.
and it was something that I like kind of noted, and I was just like, okay, so you have to wait to do this, but they don't wait to do this. But then Odysseus is like, no, you have to wait to do this. Oh, hi, Tiresias. You know?
That's why I'm more and more reading the Odyssey as like the Iliad is like super heightened reality, but the Odyssey feels even more heightened. Like it's absurdly like things as we're just talking about, things don't seem to work the way they're supposed to, even though it's insisted that it does. And I don't think that's a problem. It's only a problem
you just have
if
to kind of suspend some of your disbelief and just let things be what they are, because if you question it too much, you're like, how does this actually work?
Yeah, I mean, and again, the ancient Greek audience listening to this, yes, they were performing sacrifices, not very often, but every so often, but they certainly weren't performing blood magic and sympathetic magic to try to get crazy things to happen, or not very much at least. I'll hit on where we see more of this as we go through.
Yeah, definitely. So, as we've alluded to, he sees Elpenor, he promises to carry out these death rites. He sees his mother, and is like, no, I can't talk to you until this prophet comes, because, you know, maddening inconsistency. And then this prophet finally does appear. Tiresias appears and speaks his prophecy and gives Odysseus all of this completely invaluable information.
Yeah, and the information that Tiresias gives him, it's interesting because we get sort of current knowledge. So he explains to Odysseus, look, you're screwed because of what you did to Polyphemus, and Poseidon's pissed at you. That's why this is happening. And then he gives him a little bit of like possible futures. If you end up on Thrinakia, if your sailors eat the cattle, this might happen at this point. But then he does say, here are some things that are going to happen. You will get back to home. This is what Ithaca is going to be like. You're still going to have challenges. And then he gives him this really bizarre future about this weird pilgrimage that Odysseus has to go on in order to sort of do like a final appeasement of Poseidon toward the end of his life, in order to have that for lack of a better term, that stain on him fully wiped away.
This is one of the things that I most wanted to ask you about, because I was just like, what is he talking about?
It's bizarre, and the wording is really, I mean, it's depending on your translation, the wording is really weird, but essentially what Tiresias is saying is you have to be an evangelist. You have to take the word of Poseidon and travel to a place where people have not heard of him. And how do we sort of put that into a visual representation? You have to carry the biggest oar you can find with you, and you have to travel until you get to a land where people say, whoa, that's a cool fan you've got on your back. And they're like, okay, let me tell you about Poseidon in the ocean, which you clearly have never seen before. So it's like traveling into like the middle of America where no one has ever seen the sea.
This stood out to me especially with when we were talking about Polyphemus. I guess backing up even further up. So the Odyssey, one obvious theme is like hospitality and welcoming of strangers. Zeus is like big on that. He's like the god of strangers and beggars or something like that.
Yes.
And I couldn't quite tell exactly, but Polyphemus seemed to suggest that like Poseidon is kind of the opposite, or he isn't as, he isn't as terribly interested in that sort of stuff, and the Phaeacians suggest that sort of thing as well, right? Like Poseidon is upset that they're hospitable to like all these travelers. And so it's I guess interesting with that in mind, I guess, that Odysseus benefits from all of these I guess Zeus given rights of the stranger guest, and he is prophesied and or charged with talking about someone who isn't that person, or who isn't as much into that sort of thing. But again, I'm not sure if like that's actually a Poseidon thing, or if it's just incidental to the story, like Polyphemus is an asshole to guests or whatever because he's a cyclops and he eats men.
No, I mean that's a good point, because we certainly don't see Poseidon with that side of him, right? That's definitely something that Zeus is in charge of. It's really important that comes from the king of the gods. And on brief tangent, but on every time I talk about mythology, ancient mythology, no matter where it comes from, mythologies across the world have this element of guest friendship. It's called different things in different places. It has various types of importance, but it is crucial to the ancient world, because this is how we transfer from vendetta-driven societies to actual societies where people can get along, and if something happens, we don't endlessly just murder each other because of what happened before. It's so important, and it shows up, like I said, it shows up everywhere. But yes, that is one of Zeus's main purviews. Poseidon, yeah, in this book, especially in the Odyssey, Poseidon really holds a grudge. He's a
grumpy
does not
old
let it
bastard.
I guess when you mentioned that, so when we were talking about the Iliad, we were kind of going back and forth about, is this like anti-war? Is this pro-war? And I guess my general conclusion is that it doesn't really seem to be either. It's presenting like, the horrors of war, but it's also presenting like, what you have to do to gain glory in war, or how much like great stuff there is in war despite the horror of it.
I think I kind of fell on the side of it's both. Like, it is both pro-war and anti-war. It shows you all the glory that is there to be gotten, but it also shows you the tragic and painful things about war that maybe temper that glory.
Yeah, and it seems to be the case with the Odyssey as well. With this the concept, I guess, of Xenia, right? Welcoming of strangers, where early in the story, we have like this sort of ideal example of Xenia with like Nestor, like he's a perfect host, Telemachus is a perfect guest, and now we have sort of iterations on that further and further, and like there's like good stuff, but then as we'll find out with Odysseus and the Phaeacians, they're also doing that, but they get punished for it. So there's and so depending on where you look, like it's a good thing or it's a bad thing or it's just always corrupted. Like in book 1, Telemachus can't properly welcome a guest because his house is in such disarray. Yeah,
and of course, even within those bonds, there are of course all sorts of interesting power dynamics that come through that, and measuring like, okay, well, I visited you and you gave me this gift, but then when you came to me, I gave you this gift, and sort of there are all these checks and balances in there as well.
Yeah, there are weird politics to Xenia, which you would think, like when you talk about it, it feels like something that should be like pure, like, oh, you should just welcome strangers and give them like what they need. But especially with like, with Odysseus, like watching the games and stuff, and we were talking in that episode also, like obviously Alcinous thinks that Odysseus is like important, so he wants him to see all these things. Like that's more than what you, or different from what you would expect if he was like, some random regular looking stranger.
I think one of the things that I've brought up is I think that it's also something where there are parts to play on both sides of the act. So Xenia is not necessarily just about the guest being welcomed. It's also about the part that the guest plays. There are benefits for everyone. The guest is expected to act a certain way, being treated as a guest, and that provides benefits for the host. And the host is expected to welcome the guest in a certain way, and that provides benefits for the guest.
Yeah, and part of that relationship baked into it on some level is, okay, somebody shows up at my house, I'm going to treat them well, because at some point in the future, I might be traveling to show up at their house. So there's always this back and forth. And also, I mean, again, based on stories about the gods, there's always way back in the back of your head, this might be a god in disguise. I better treat this person well.
Which is exactly what happens with Nestor. So it like works out exactly the way it's supposed to.
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
With all that being said, we now know exactly what Odysseus needs to do for the rest of his life, thanks to Tiresias.
Is weird.
Well, yeah,
weird, and I still don't completely understand like the importance of the. So in Emily Wilson's translation, he says when you meet somebody, a traveler who calls the thing you carry on your back a winnowing fan, then fix that ore in earth, make sacrifices to Poseidon, then you'll go home and offer holy hecatombs to all the deathless gods who live in heaven, and then gentle death will come to you. So that's what we get in the Emily Wilson translation, and I was just like, what is a winnowing fan? Why is he carrying an oar around?
Yeah, and that's pretty similar.
Hecatombs?
That's pretty similar to other translations as well. And yeah, just there's so much packed into that. But yeah, essentially the idea is that, again, he's going to carry an oar that would be recognizable to anybody who's been on the ocean, but then go to a land where they don't recognize it. They think it's some sort of winnowing is it's part of agriculture. So they're like, oh, that's a weird, thing you've got there. And he's like, no, let me tell you about the ocean and Poseidon. And then he gets to go home.
Oh. Okay, that's really interesting, especially in the context of this being a story about him being basically at sea for all this time. And then finally, when he finds the agricultural people, like, this is when you'll find home.
Yeah.
And this is also, like, I've talked over and over about, like, I feel that, and I think this is probably not a hard jump to make, that the Iliad is a book about war, or a poem about war, and the Odyssey is a poem about home. That tickles that happy part of my brain that's like, this is the part about the prophecy, and that I'm now understanding. I think this is another slightly mind-blowing moment for me, where, like, the agriculture is when he reaches home. The agriculture is when he reaches Ithaca, which is at its heart, a goatly, and land-based place.
Yeah.
Where he has his kingdom, like, in the soil.
Yeah, that totally works. That tracks.
So I love that.
The other thing I was going to say, oh no, did it just leave? So in a lot of these stories, so the Iliad, the Odyssey, and then like the tragedies, there's a very transactional, formulaic things that happens specifically with the big heroes, in that if they promise the gods, I'm going to do this thing in the future, give me this benefit now. And we are going to see in the next book that this doesn't work for normal people, this only works for the heroes. But essentially, there is an idea here that Odysseus, hearing this from Tiresias, accepting this as his fate, means it's going to happen, and so he will be able to get home. So there's like a time loop kind of thing going on. And we, like I said, we see this a lot of times. There was the race, the boat race, where one of the captains says, "I'm Poseidon, I'm gonna do all of these crazy sacrifices to you as soon as I get back," and then he wins, because promising you're going to do something means you will definitely do it. It's sort of like a Bill and Ted's kind of time travel thing.
Oh my god, I love those movies.
Example that stands out to me is like the archery contest in the Iliad, where one person fails to promise to Apollo, but the other one does, and he gets the dove.
Yep.
I will say, I guess as a formal observation, this has happened enough times to where I'm getting suspicious. Prophecies of what is going to happen, like in the book or in the like particular story, happening throughout the story. This happened a bunch in the Iliad, like early on when I guess Odysseus reminds people of the prophecy that they'll win, and then more immediately, like when Zeus keeps talking about, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. Patroclus will die, Achilles will enter the fray, and it just it spoils itself, right? Constantly. It's like, okay, this is what will happen. And this is doing the exact same thing. And so I'm curious, I guess, like this feels like more than just, this feels like it's performing a narrative purpose as well as like something that Odysseus just has to do. Yeah,
and again, I think that all ties back to the idea of the audience who's listening to this knows all of these stories, but they're looking for the little, how did Homer, quote unquote, tell this story a little bit differently? What added elements does he have? What different twists does this story go through? But we know it's all going to end up in the same place. These characters are generally going to end up in the place that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I get the feeling from it that it's almost kind of like a preview where you know what's going to happen, but then you have to kind of be on the edge of your seat wondering, like, how, though? How is it going to happen? How is he going to, like, bring all of this stuff to pass?
Yeah. Well, and also, too, especially how sprawling these stories are, we're not going to get this scene in this book. So this is you know, maybe the next poet who comes to town is going to tell the future stories of Odysseus. Who knows? So, and then how different might that story be, even though this prophecy was in this story? So it's all these interesting different webs of stories and characters doing different things over, you know, all these different tales.
I guess when you say that, it has like a really meta function as well, where it's like, okay, if you're listening to this, you'll probably hear about this from like me, the poet, or like another poet.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, so I just saw, it was a Star Wars meme, but it was about how in episode 4 they referenced the Clone Wars, but nobody had any idea what that was, and then over time that's evolved into so many other things from different people telling the stories. So it's sort of like that. It's like, yeah, this is part of this world, but somebody else is going to come around and tell the story, and it might be, you know, it might go off into a direction that you never even thought of.
It's why the scene where Palpatine says to Vader, like, surely this must be the, you know, Anakin Skywalker's spawn, and you're like, okay, but now we have the other movies, so we know that there's this whole backstory, but they had no idea when they wrote that.
Exactly.
Would other poets have been listening to this? Like, would...
Oh, I would imagine so.
I mean, yeah, it's so hard to... So in the time when quote-unquote Homer lived, you know, we're talking like, I mean, yes, there were famous poets who were traveling around doing things, so possibly, I mean, certainly by the time we get to the more of the classical era with, you know, the playwrights and stuff, they absolutely knew what everybody else was doing and how they were changing stories.
Yeah, when you mention like the Clone Wars and stuff like that, like and people other than the original storyteller got to take that and run. Right? We had books, we had TV show. I guess we kind of had the movies from the same guy as well, but you know, like it inspired like a whole bunch of other things. And I wonder if like, does that sort of play that role where you like just leave that in and you maybe have plans for it later? Maybe other people will take it and tell the story as well if the muse so speaks to them, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, like sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was going to continue on with this with the endless shades that Odysseus talks to.
Yeah, I was going to say like we got what we came here for in 150 lines, and we still have a fair amount of book to go through.
Yes.
This is not a short book. How many lines is this book overall?
Yeah, this is a long one.
Just short of 650.
Okay.
So let us sally forth.
Yes. So Odysseus talks to Elpenor. He talks to Tiresias. He talks to his mom. And similarly, like we were saying before, the mom, even though she's there, she has to drink the blood. Oh, and I do want to say that when Odysseus sees his mom, that they try to embrace Wriste, as you mentioned. And there's a really cool thing, if you keep track, if you pay attention, in ancient Greek, especially in the epic poems, but also in the tragedies. 3 times, yes. Whenever I do my stream...
We've had this discussion many times.
3 is 100% a magic number. It comes up all the time. It's so great.
It does. It's a source of endless fascination for me because, like, it'll always... Like, I'll kind of forget the last time I saw it, and then it'll come back up, and... I'm gonna ruin another thing with Monty Python for Dr. Dan, but it always reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and it's 1, 2, 5, 3, sir, 3.
Yes.
I love stuff like that. I don't know, it grounds me for some reason. It gives structure. Like even if there is like no real meaning, and we've like discussed or we've been offered like one possibility, like 3 is a very significant number, and if it's like tried 3 times and it fails, then that wasn't supposed to happen. Same thing with the epithets. Like I love, like it does that same sort of thing where it's comfy, it's home.
Yeah. Well, and another thing to think about every so often is that when the poet, quote unquote Homer, whoever was going around telling him this, it wasn't written down. This was all by memory. So there are lots of tricks and things in here to keep all of this in the memory, to jump back and forth between places. So that's partly why we have epithets. We have repeated sections that say the exact same thing or maybe slightly different. We have the same numbers appear over and over again because the dude just has to keep it all in his head.
Yeah. And even then, like the 3 times attempted to embrace his mother, like it's so much different than just I tried to embrace her, but I failed because she was a shade. Like it's saying the same thing, but it feels much more significant when it's just
it gives it an emphasis.
I think it certainly makes the emotional impact of it because, like, he talks about how sharp the pain is, you know, that he can't hug her. It made me so sad. He can't hug his mom. And she gives him some really useful information too. I mean, she basically tells him Persephone is chilling. Persephone is holding down the fort. You know, there's all these
Penelope,
suitors.
But yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No,
names. Names. There's a lot of them in this book.
Yes.
Penelope is holding down the fort, and no one has usurped his throne yet.
Right. Yeah, and Anticlea here is a good example of this weird relationship with knowledge, because when she first starts talking to him,
how do you know? Like, how does she know this?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and the first thing she says is, "Why are you here? Did you just die at Troy? Were you home?" There's this weird gap. Like there's so much that she doesn't know, and then all of a sudden there's so much that she does know.
Fuck! I had a thing, but it escaped me. So
perhaps it will come back as we.
We'll knock it loose.
It's gonna bother me. It's gonna bother me so much. That's the question. Odysseus has been described as unlucky a lot. Now, when we think of luck, I can't help but feel like we are thinking of something a little bit different from what is being referenced. Like if I had to describe Odysseus with any word, unlucky would be like really low on the list, at least like from a modern understanding of what it means to like have luck or have not luck. Can you shed some light on why is Odysseus unlucky?
Yeah, and I think anytime you see things any wording that has to do with luck, I mean, it really all ties into fate. So I think one way you might explain it is that he's saddled with a difficult fate, right? He is going to get everything that he really wants. He's going to get home. He's going to be back with his wife. His son is doing great, relatively speaking. His father's still alive, which is kind of crazy. But to get there, he's fated to go through all of these horrible experiences. Some of his own causing, not all of them, I'll admit. But yeah, I think that's probably like a more wholesome way of explaining what that means.
Yeah, I like that interpretation of it because I like the idea that, like, I think we think of luck as like, oh, I got a lucky hand in a poker game, or I had this one lucky individual event, or I was unlucky to have tripped and fallen over that tree root and smashed my face in. Not that has ever happened to me. Definitely,
or more so that luck is like an unprompted, unexplainable happening.
It's an organic thing, but this is more like and this is a point where his mother literally calls him the most unlucky man alive. I think it's a great interpretation to say what she's saying here is not that like his luck in events, his organic luck is bad, but that like he has been just unlucky to be destined to such a difficult and like kind of torturous fate. So I love that interpretation. And so after she, after they can't hug, she kind of urges him to, go to the light, which cracked me up a little bit. And so that you may remember all these things so you can tell your wife in times to come. And this is when we get into another weird section that I have some, like, I want to hear your thoughts about very much, because now we get into all of the the women sent by Persephone.
Yes.
Not
Yeah, so
Penelope. I'm about to mix these names up a bunch. So these are the daughters and wives of warriors.
Yes. So what is going on here? Why is this important? And you really have to dig deep for basically the meta-textual analysis here. So every story that Odysseus hears and all the characters he meets, we have to try to dig out, okay, why is this important? What is this telling Odysseus? And what is this telling the audience, the ancient audience who is listening to this story? So essentially what it breaks down to, generally speaking, is that all of these tales are going to include scenes of gods doing sneaky things, gods being so powerful you can't countermand what they're up to. Be very careful about homecomings. Be very careful about boasting about the wrong thing. So all of those things are elements of all of these little stories. And yeah, so first we have like what sometimes is described as like the parade of women, which is kind of weird, but sure. I mean, it makes sense. So yeah, all these ladies come up and they're like, here's this lady, and yeah.
Not gonna lie, I kind of hate that because like some of these stories are very dicey, I guess is the way that I'll put this. Like, to be open about it, like there are some stories about what amounts to sexual assault by the gods, what amounts to really weird sexual power dynamics with the gods.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about stories of rape and of gods disguising themselves as husbands in order to sleep with their wives. Like, it's all this. It's horrible, horrible things. But again, that's sort of through those stories we're getting. Okay, this is an example of the power and the guile of Poseidon. This is the power and guile of Zeus. Here's all of the crazy things that they can do, and we as humans are just like, well, I guess it's gonna happen, and there's nothing I can do about it.
It also makes me think back to when Calypso was ordered by Hermes to let Odysseus go, and in that book, like she gave a very gendered response. She was like, when the male gods do all this, like they get to do whatever they want, but whenever a female goddess tries to do this, they get angry. And in that episode, I was like, oh, I'm curious as to like how this bears out, and this
is
seems
how.
to directly answer that. It's like, oh,
this is exactly how.
and the text itself seems to be accounting for that claim. Now that you've like couched it in that way.
Yeah. I mean, even goddesses are frequently like they try to do things. Male gods come in and counteract it, and I mean it's pretty much the only inviolable things that even goddesses can do is the few that will always be chaste and always be virgins, and that is what will never be broken. Like that's how deeply patriarchal, however you want to describe it, all of this society and their reflections within the religion is that the one thing that some goddesses, the most powerful goddesses can enshrine and make sure is never broken is their virginity. That's the one thing that they have control over sometimes.
Yeah, like Athena and Artemis
do
they come to mind, I guess?
Yeah, specifically.
Thanks,
So, yeah.
I hate it.
Yeah.
But it's just, I think, a reality of these works, the time period that they were created in, the kind of belief system that they're constructed with. It's interesting to see it as a modern reader of this, obviously, and I have to wonder, like, obviously the interpretation of this would have been much, much different, way back when people were hearing this in real time. But yeah, right now, in this present time, thanks, I hate it.
Yeah. But Agreed.
It does serve these women and their stories do serve a really important purpose here, which I think you have kind of illuminated really well for us, which is as this kind of lesson of like, don't mess with the gods. You will always regret it
And we'll see the biggest object lesson in that in Sisyphus when we see him a little bit later,
Oh,
right?
poor Sisyphus.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so going through really briefly, so Tyro is the first one, and again, yeah, it's about how Poseidon came down and had his way with with whatever women he wanted and got away with it. Antiope is about the power of Zeus. Alcmene, the mother of Heracles, is again Zeus comes down, takes the form of her husband, has sex with her, and leaves, and then we get into Epicast and Oedipus. So then we get into like the futility of fate. Like you can't fight against your fate because that's going to happen no matter what, which Odysseus will strain against at times. Chloris is kind of an interesting story because that one is very convoluted with all the people and the children and the challenges set up to marry this one, and then the guy comes and then he's imprisoned for there's a lot there. But that one too is teaching Odysseus about setting up impossible challenges, about patience, and again about the will of Zeus. So there are reflections of some of these stories that Odysseus will sort of pick up on when he gets home and how he treats the suitors and what he does.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a large degree, I found it to be kind of about this is the way to bide your time until things are right and you can strike while the iron is hot.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we get the story of Leda, and we hear about how noble her children are. Because again, Odysseus is worried about, what is my son up to? What is he going to be like when I get home? And then Iphigenia is similar with Poseidon coming in, and then the children she has with Poseidon then go and try to fight the gods, and you don't want to do that because that never ends well.
And they're dead.
Yeah. And they were so young, they didn't even have beards yet.
Wait, did they try to fight the gods, or was it like prophesy? Oh, okay. Sorry, going off of memory, I thought it was like they could have fought the gods, but they were killed when they were young.
No, it says they brought the din of dreadful raging war to the immortal gods and tried to sit Asa and Pelion? Trees, leaves, and all on Mount Olympus, high up in the sky. They might have managed it if they had reached full adulthood. So it's like basically if they had let themselves grow a little older, they might have had a chance. Probably still no, but like as young as they were with their little no beard baby faces, they had no fucking chance.
Yeah,
and
the story is cool though because they're giants. They're like crazy tall, and they literally stack mountains on top of each other to try to get up to challenge the gods on Olympus.
There are a lot of giants in the Odyssey. That is something that has like been poking at my brain a little bit. Like how many times giants? Like there's an obsession with giants in this poem.
Yeah, I wonder if that's born out of like frustration. As you're mentioning it. Like when we write stories about like really cool characters, right, like action heroes or whatever, in a way we're sort of manifesting something that we wish we could have. Like we wish we could exert this kind of control over the world. And yeah, now that you mention it, there are a lot of giants. Like there's a Cyclops who's also super huge. There's
the giant island who throw boulders at all of them.
Yeah, and talking about these guys as well, it's like the story is sort of reaching as we're talking about fighting against your fate or like giving into it and like just dealing with it because no one wins against the gods. It seems like a little frustrated maybe.
Yeah, well, and Odysseus is one of the heroes. He's not often described as being particularly tall, so he doesn't have that
wide guy.
Certainly unlike Achilles and Ajax, who are always described as being super massive dudes.
Strong,
Odysseus is short and thick.
Yeah.
so okay. Oh no, please.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, as we're talking about this, I didn't expect we'd talk as much about like fate and agency as we would here, because when we were talking about the Iliad, I sort of had like a small breakdown, especially when we were talking about we were at the end. I was like, how do we handle like personal responsibility, like how much can we lay at the feet of these characters and how much do we lay at the feet of the gods? And the place I arrived at was sort of like this absurd, like it doesn't really matter and it doesn't make much sense to say like with or without the gods anyway, because the gods are always there and always doing things, but it's also cyclical. Like fate is there, but Zeus can exert his will over it, and sometimes you can exert your will on Zeus, but only if you're like a hero. And
Yep. Yeah, we always hear, oh, fate is set in stone, but then if Zeus really wants to, he can change it. And yeah.
Is it? I don't think it is.
Yeah, there's obviously there is definitely some fluidity to it. It's not literally, well, figuratively literally set in stone. There is some wiggle room there with fate for the ancient Greeks.
But only
as long
if
as
you're a
you're
hero.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. So do we want to move past the parade of women, or did we want to delve further into any of their stories?
So this is the part where I was about to say, like, and this is the part when we, for whatever reason, I still can't understand, we cut back to the present. And we are back in Alcinous's palace, and Arete is just... I'm so confused. She's just like, look at him, what a tall, handsome man, and what a mind,
So I feel okay. So there I think there are a few different things going on. Every so often, we want to be reminded of the framing story, so we know where we are in the overall narrative, right? So we've got that going. We do want to continually build up Odysseus as a great character. He's great in everything. Look, he's a great fighter. He's super sly. He talks really well. He tells a good story. So we're re-emphasizing that aspect. But also, I think there's an element of delayed gratification. So we have Odysseus in the underworld. We know there are all sorts of cool people there he might run into. He sees all of these ancient, ladies from stories that have gone previously. He hears about all of them. Okay, now we're going to take a break, but wait, are we done with that? What else? Who else could we see?
What about the heroes?
Yes. So I think there's definitely an aspect of that. Again, Odysseus like, oh, I'm real tired. Should we just call it a night? And they're like,
so
no, please tell us more. This is the part that
gets you like back hanging on your seat for more.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolute literary device.
Yeah, and two, so Odysseus is telling the story to the Phaeacians. He says, okay, I want to stop. And he's sort of giving them an invitation to ask, well, did you talk to any of the other heroes? Or, what else was there? Tell us more. So then then he can, build up the story even beyond that. So yeah, I think it's a combination of all those things. The last thing I'll say there's as an option is, again, remembering that this is an epic poem that was recited by the poet. Yeah. This is a part in the story where possibly this is a specific break built in. If the poet forgot a part, he could just jump right to this. If the poet was feeling particularly inspired and wanted to add other stories of other famous women and then push this back a little bit, potentially there could be some adjustment to the actual text.
Or, this could even be a portion where people, like, are tired and need a little bit of pick-me-up in between, verses, and they can go grab another mixing bowl of wine.
Funnel cake, yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, there was no rule that you had to... There was no rule that you had to do the entire poem in one sitting. Yeah, there were breaks.
I can't imagine that.
Right, yeah, you would pick up the next day, for sure.
So there's also one thing that I can point out that I guess I just noticed as I was looking through the passage as we were talking about it. I've had a feeling that Alcinous and at least Arete are like a little wary of Odysseus because he speaks so well, and because like he seems like the kind of guy who could pull a fast one on you. But there is, and this I think was signaled when Odysseus asked, what was the blind poet's name again? I can't remember.
Tiresias.
No, the blind poet.
Oh, the
blind
poet.
Bard,
The poet.
the bard.
Yeah.
The bard.
Right. The stand-in for Homer.
Yeah. When he basically tested him, asked trying to see if he was really inspired by the muse. Like, oh, tell me about this particular Trojan War story, and it's like spot on. And so this, when Alcinous says, many people are cheats and liars and thieves, and you don't seem to be that way. And he compares him to a poet. I think what I'm suspecting is the implication is that if you are truly a poet, you are like divinely inspired, and then by that metric, you wouldn't be telling tall tales. I have reason to believe you when you are telling all these crazy adventures to us.
Yeah, and like with that other poet, yeah, there's certainly elements of like, poets are really cool.
There's a little bit of wink, wink,
Yeah,
nudge, nudge in
right.
there. Of like,
Yeah,
oh,
written by a poet, yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. So then we get to the big ones.
The big
So we
names.
go back and Odysseus is like, all right, I'll tell you about the heroes.
The
And we
heavy
dive
hitters.
right in.
The heavy hitters. We're going to
Yes,
get right
yes.
into them. So the first one of them is Agamemnon, who we've heard about a significant amount, up to this point. There have been several retellings of the story of how he met his fate at the hands of Aegisthus and his wife Clytemnestra. And now we get to hear it straight from the horse's mouth.
And he is he's a blubbering mess.
He's really kind of
wailing,
pitiful.
he's weeping. Yeah. So this is a big moment, obviously with Achilles coming up, but Agamemnon and Achilles. What can you take away from the Iliad as far as what does a hero want to accomplish, and what does that mean for his legacy? But then we see what happens with Agamemnon and Achilles here, and it's like, wait a minute, this is not partly. I mean, we'll discuss, especially when we get to Achilles in a minute, but it's a bit different here, and like what comes from the kind of glory that you were seeking if you're an Iliadic hero. Versus what we see here, because Agamemnon he's not happy.
Yeah, and it feels almost like Odysseus is like unintentionally taunting him a little bit by being like, "What happened to you? Did your ship crash? Did you get killed on land? Like, were you fighting for something?" And he's just like, "No, my fucking wife killed me."
It was real bad, man.
Can you believe this? Can you believe this woman and her lover, killed me like an ox is killed at a manger? But what I really love about his description of his own death is the part like where he says, and I'm going to quote this, it's around line 418, but you would grieve with even deeper pity if you could see us lying dead beneath the tables piled with food and wine. I love that, because it really just gives a sense of these values that they have, that like killing someone in war is one thing, but killing someone in their home and killing someone who you have shared your home with is like the ultimate dishonor.
Yep. And that very specifically, those words are a foreshadowing of the death of the suitors when
Absolutely.
Odysseus finally gets home. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, sort of
Agamemnon's
inverted
entire
version of
story is a kind of topsy-turvy version of what is going to happen with Odysseus and the suitors that he finds in his home, which in this case, Orestes his son is the one who gets the revenge for Agamemnon, but Odysseus is going to go back and rampage. And it's going to be intense. But this is that foreshadowing of that. And I don't think this is the first time we get that foreshadowing, but it is, I think, one of the strongest.
Telemachus has been compared to Orestes, I think, a couple times earlier on. I guess this is the time where Odysseus gets to identify with Agamemnon, the father, as opposed to the son doing the same.
Yeah.
Which I guess I never really thought about this exchange as being that up until now, but it makes a lot of sense. If I can call back really quickly, just to something that I mentioned before about epithets and how I really like that, like even though we use the same epithet, like for like whenever, like swift-footed Achilles or long-suffering Odysseus, like or my favorite,
the blazing helmet,
Hector with the flashing helmet. But one of the examples that I used when I was describing this is like Lord of Men Agamemnon would hit differently if Agamemnon were like laying there dying. And I didn't anticipate this, but here it is. Like he calls him Lord of Men Agamemnon. Yeah. He's dead.
And it's especially fitting, I think, that it comes after this like really pitiable description of him, because you see him at his absolute worst and his absolute like most just pitiful, and then you get Lord of Men King Agamemnon.
So and then like more specifically to Odysseus and to his story. So here Agamemnon, like with the the poorly named parade of women, but they're all these sort of things that Odysseus should keep in the back of his head. So here there is no ambiguity about it. Agamemnon is like, when you go home, beware your wife, test her, make sure that everything is cool, because there are evil wives out there. I've got the evilest of them all. So so Odysseus is like, all right.
I really found it interesting how this was rendered in Emily Wilson's translation, and I'll read it to you really quick. And I'll read the few lines before, because Odysseus says, curse her. Zeus has always brought disaster to the house of Atreus through women. Many men were lost for Helen, and Clytemnestra formed this plot against you when you were away. And like, I can see Agamemnon with like wide eyes just saying, so, at once he answered, so you must never treat your wife too well. Do not let her know everything you know, tell her some things, hide others, but like, you must not treat your wife too well. Holy crap.
On the other hand, he also has like this mysterious dead people knowledge that dead people have, where he's like, but like, you don't have to worry about her, but at the same time worry about her. Like he's I think it's a bit of a yo-yo. He goes like, don't treat her too well, but she's cool, but you don't trust her.
She's one of the good ones.
He really needs afterlife therapy.
Yeah.
Like he's dealing.
He has always needed therapy. I've said this from the very beginning, and I maintain it.
Yeah, and then too, this segment ends with Agamemnon pleading Odysseus for information about his son Orestes, which of course Odysseus doesn't have. But there's also one of those cool elements. It's like, okay, well, this is a thread that doesn't end in this tale, but we'll pick it. But you, the audience, the story. You know where that goes. You know what's going to happen in that one. And then, maybe the next poet who comes through town will tell you about Orestes.
Yeah, absolutely. And now the big one.
Yes.
This is a moment that I've been waiting for, certainly. And I know you, Scott, as well have been waiting for this, because this is when we get Achilles and Patroclus.
Yeah. So Achilles comes up, and everything that we saw in the Iliad. And again, so there's obviously, I'm sure you talked about it at the end of the Iliad. The Iliad doesn't end with Achilles dying, like, right? It's the Iliad is literally a story of the anger of Achilles, how it comes about, what he does, and how it ends. That's it. There's all these other elements that we don't get within it. The Odyssey obviously refers to it, but we see Achilles, and from everything we've read before, you might think, well, he got his glory. He was the best fighter at Troy. He killed all of any opponent he ever met. He should be happy in the underworld. Nope. couldn't be further from the truth.
Which, I think is kind of fitting, because I think we have this tendency of thinking of Achilles as this really great, like, all good type of person. But I always came down, so this is a conversation we had a number of times, like, is Achilles the good one? Is Agamemnon the good one? I was just like, they both suck. But
yeah, well, they're both human, just blown up to an absurd level.
Yeah,
amplified. They both get mad. They both get sad. They both cry at things. They have loves. They have loss. I mean, like, it's everything every part of the human experience are packed into these heroes and inflated to, like I said, an absurd degree.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, this is just a small, we can glance right over this, but I love the way he greets Odysseus, at least in this translation. My lord Odysseus, you fox. That cracked me up a little bit. And just one hell of a way to greet a guy that you haven't seen since before you died and are now seeing in the afterlife.
Yeah. So in Lattimore, I think that part is just resourcely Odysseus. So I think it's the idea
really
of like crafty and wily and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, and Odysseus says, hey Achilles, like, you died with, like, we honored you the most of everything. Do not grieve even in death, Achilles. And Achilles says these super famous lines that most people don't know where they come from. That it comes from right here in the Odyssey. And again, like, I'll just read the Lattimore, but O shining Odysseus, never try to console me for dying. I would rather follow the plow as thrall to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead. So he's saying, I would rather be a slave on earth than a ruler over the dead.
Yeah, and then it's basically the same. It's basically the same in the Emily Wilson edition. Odysseus, you must not comfort me for death. I would prefer to be a workman hired by a poor man on a peasant farm than rule as king of all the dead.
Yes, there's mainly like there's no such thing as a good death. So, take that.
And this also cashes in on sort of the sentiment that he was entertaining in the embassy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, yeah, maybe living forever, or maybe living a long time but in comfort and no glory is better than dying young with glory.
Yeah.
I also like that, true to pattern, we know that Patroclus is there. We don't hear from him. He's there, but he doesn't say anything.
The silent partner.
Yep.
So this is one of the reasons why I love Achilles as a character. So, like, all of the, like, cool shit that he does, fine. But, like, for someone who can at so many times be kind of an unregulated emotional man-child, he also has these moments of incredibly profound wisdom or outlook on life that give so much of, like, the emotional core to these poems, these epic poems. Like, it puts the epic into it for me, because there are just these profound statements that, like, you could read and just be like, okay, well, he would prefer to be a peasant than dead, but that says so much when you think about his entire storyline throughout the Iliad.
It doesn't it doesn't necessarily contradict it, but it's a whole different side, and now he knows better. Like, literally,
Exactly.
he's gone to the other side. He's seen what comes of this choice that he made.
It's a very hindsight is 2020 moment. It's a very, like, there's no way that you can know that without experiencing it, and experiencing something changes you. This is something that every person who is alive will experience. So that just, like, is almost like this gut punch to me.
Of course, there is also the other side of it, where if Odysseus were talking to, like, a poor man hired, or a slave hired by a farmer, he'd probably say the exact opposite, right? Like, I wish I could have had glory in the Battle of Troy, where, like, all my relatives got to fight, but I had to stay here, or something like that. So, although Achilles says this, he's also, I suspect anyway, speaking from some level of ignorance, because he probably doesn't know what it's like to live like that, just as much as someone who does live like that doesn't know what it's like to be a hero who both deals out suffering and suffers a lot as well. So the grass is always greener or browner on the other side, depending on how poorly you want to see the world.
Yeah, that's fair. And then we get, just as it seems like Achilles is fully evolved past the type of hero that he was, seeking the kind of glory that he was in the Iliad, when he says this crazy, impactful line. But then he does say, so what's going on with my dad and my son? And then Odysseus is like, your kid is just... Yeah,
let me tell you about your kid. He's a badass.
Yeah, he is cutting him down left and right, and then Achilles literally, like, puffs up and walks away all tall.
He loves to hear this. Like, he's like, okay, the nut didn't fall far from the tree. I did my job. Like, my son is cool. He's badass. I mean, he tells this story about, like, how inside the Trojan horse, like, everyone is all, like, pale and sweaty and kind of shitting themselves and scared. And Achilles' son is just like, no big deal. This is fine. We're gonna be okay. He wants to get out there and fight.
Yeah, that's always been the frustrating thing about Achilles, right? He's always, like, so close, and yet, but he always, like, rebounds back to like this heroic fighting man archetype.
He's a bro. He goes back to his bro mentality.
Absolutely a bro.
Yeah. But yeah, and so again, like, looking at people have spent a lot of time talking about this section in particular, but again, this idea of an Iliadic hero versus an Odyssey style hero, and what does this mean that Achilles is saying? And it's still ambiguous. It's still a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Achilles, regrets things that happened and wishes he could have, obviously, clearly he wishes that he could have, stayed alive rather than die. But he's hoping his kid is out there tearing it up. So, and that's cool.
It's honestly like a little bit of a sweet kind of proud papa moment.
Yeah.
Well, and also, since we're talking about pitting like Iliadic heroes against someone like Odysseus, like we get a little bit of that with Ajax and Odysseus.
Ajax is still salty in the afterlife.
Now, I will preface this next conversation by saying that Ajax is my personal favorite character.
Ajax is pretty cool.
Everybody. He's amazing. They say he's the second greatest warrior among the Greeks, and the gods never help him directly. All of his exploits are his alone,
which I
think is really, really interesting. Yeah. Diomedes, gods are always helping him, moving his arm, blocking stuff. Not Ajax, no. So if you, I don't know how much you've talked about the sort of what happens to Ajax in between the two books.
We know a little bit. We know that there's the trial of arms, I believe it's called, where Achilles' armor is sort of up for grabs, and like who is like which of his closest friends or what have you like deserves to take it back. And Ajax cites his great act as a warrior, while Odysseus outwits him in debate, and his words win him what Ajax's actions, for whatever reason, can't. And he goes mad. He aims to kill like the entire Greek army, but he goes mad, and the gods strike him with madness, and he kills a bunch of cows instead. And then when he comes to, he's like, oh wow, this is terrible. I have dishonored myself so much. I'm just going to fall on that one sword that Hector gave me a long time ago. And that's how he ends up there. And this all because Odysseus, I don't know exactly how it plays out. I haven't read any depiction of this, but I would suspect that Odysseus uses some like underhanded tactics, or like everyone would know that Ajax is the person who would deserve these arms because he is a great warrior.
Yeah.
But whatever Odysseus said was so impactful that he undercut all of that, which would really suck if you're someone great like Ajax.
Right, and who like Achilles, Ajax's entire goal is to get glory and get honor. He was not one of the highest ranked kings, in the weird hierarchy we have of the Argives. But yeah, everything Ajax does is about honor and glory. So when he is deprived of what he feels is rightfully his, dishonored by everybody around him, he's like, okay, well, at that point he can either kill himself or take revenge. So he tries that route, and then the gods prevent that from happening. So then all he's left with is suicide at that point.
Very Achilles-like reaction, because Achilles basically does the exact same thing. He's like, okay, I'll just wish that Zeus kills the entire Achaean army until I decide to come back.
Yeah, now, so a lot of what you just said, we have that story from Sophocles' Ajax, from the tragedy. We get little teases of it here and there, but not like a full recounting. But it is noticeable that here there are some differences, because it says, so Odysseus is talking about what happened, and he says that the arms of Achilles were the prize, and the sons of Trojans with Pallas Athena judged. So here the judges specifically are Athena and Trojan, captives of war. But that's not always the case, because in Sophocles, the judges are Agamemnon, Menelaus, and the other commanders. So that's kind of a big difference between... So there are differences between the stories and the people. Yeah. Especially with his revenge plots. It's like, well, here it's like, well, you could argue that, well, if these other people judged it, why are you going after Agamemnon and Menelaus? When in Sophocles, it's like, no, they did this, and you're going after them directly, which arguably makes more sense. But anyway, so we talk about how the shades in the underworld, they have very little life, spirit, animus, whatever you want to call it. And one of the only ways to get that and to gain glory is to actually speak with somebody who's alive, to spread your story and to get it out there. And Odysseus is like, Ajax, come over here. And Ajax is like, just gives him the middle finger and turns around and walks away.
Yeah.
Which is just such an amazing moment.
I love that.
And he even says in it, Odysseus says, I like, he imagines what their conversation could have been like. Because Odysseus said, he calls out to him and he says, look, he doesn't quite say he's sorry for what he did. He's sorry for how it turned out. And he said, and look, we all, the entire Greek army, we all grieved for you. It was such a huge loss that you were gone. I regret what happened.
Yeah, it's like kind of a classic, like, non-apology apology.
Yeah. Sorry, not sorry. Yeah.
It makes me think of Agamemnon a lot when he, like, gets so close to, like, a real apology, but then he, like, lays the blame on Zeus and the gods and all that stuff, which, and like, when reading, that seems like something that's kind of valid to say because the gods do fuck with shit, but at the same time, it doesn't really mean much to someone's heart.
Like, just say sorry. Just say sorry.
Exactly.
Well, and we'll see this with Odysseus at various points later on in the book, especially at the very end with his dad. And it's I mean, you'll have a very long conversation about that scene because it's super weird and how he approaches his dad and can't bring himself to admit the truth for a really long time.
I love that scene so much. It's like really the most emotionally impactful scene I've read of all the parts in Homer. That's all I'll say about it for now.
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much. But yeah, so sort of stepping back a little bit and saying, okay, well, if Odysseus is supposed to learn from all of his interactions, what is he learning from Ajax? Well, he's seeing a character who is completely implacable, has no ability to change, which is something that Odysseus, well, he's described as having the ability to change. Does he change? That's something we can argue depending on where we are in the book. And also Odysseus is seeing this person who has put his principles above glory at this point.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is again something that Odysseus struggles with at different times. What's more important? And it's just, and Ajax just walks off and that's it.
Yeah. And now we're kind of
small interactions to just like rapid fire, like quick.
Yeah, the end of this book is very like, I also kind of love the way this ties off like Odysseus. So this is an unreliable narrator moment. Odysseus kind of ties this off by saying, despite his rage, we might have spoken longer. You didn't speak. He didn't talk to you. We might have spoken longer if I had not felt in my heart an urge to see more spirits. Like, no, this guy blew you off and now you have to go on to the rest of the people that are there. Okay, Odysseus. All right. Keep talking that talk. I got a good chuckle out of that. So we see a bunch of people, again, in a kind of rapid fire way. We see Orion, we see Titius, we see,
Titius.
And then we see Sisyphus,
Sisyphus and Tantalus.
In his unending labor.
Yeah, and so there are a couple of different things going on here. Part of the... So we talked before about how, like, for a great hero who sort of does everything, part of it is going down into the underworld and then coming back, right? It's death and resurrection. But then, so there's a question here, like, well, does Odysseus really go into the underworld? Because he's kind of, like, at the entrance, and he's interacting with shades. So I think part of this story and all of these weird characters we interact with is just sort of like, Odysseus, even though he's not really going into the underworld, he's getting a tour of the underworld. So this is also a way for the poet to say, well, he's seeing all these people who died over here, and then there are the ladies, and then there are the heroes, and over here are the, I like to call, like, Tantalus and Sisyphus transgressors. Some people call them sinners, which is not, it has so much loaded Christianity to it that it's not really the right word. But, like, people who transgressed against the gods. So we're getting, like, the landscape of the underworld, even if Odysseus isn't actually traveling through it.
This brings me right back to the conversation that we had with Dr. Kira Jones, that blew my mind, about Achilles' shield, where she kind of told us that, like, it could represent, in a lot of ways, all of these possibilities of life that Achilles could have lived out. All of these stories that he'll never really get because he chooses war and glory. This feels very much like that to me. This is like, these are the things that could have potentially happened to you, Odysseus, but this isn't your fate. Your fate is to go home. Your fate is to carry this oar. You know, your fate is to do all of these things that you've been told that you need to do, and that are designated by fate to happen to you.
Yeah, and he sees other legendary characters. Yeah, like Orion is just sort of hanging out in the underworld, and then like these transgressor characters, and then of course their horrific punishments in the underworld, which are always like
poor Tantalus and Sisyphus. You know, Tantalus being the character who is steeped up to his like chin in water, but as soon as he bends down to drink, the water disappears and he can never parch his thirst. And Sisyphus, obviously, or maybe not obviously to some, if you haven't heard it, Sisyphus is a character who is doomed to push an incredibly heavy boulder up a hill. And as soon as he gets to the top of the hill, the boulder rolls back down and he has to do it all over again, ad infinitum.
And it's such a testament to the ancient Greeks that they came up with these, like, no matter who you are in the world, where you're born, what language you speak, you hear these stories and like there's a part of you that just like shrivels up inside, like imagining these insane punishments. We all get it, we all understand it, no matter where your place is in the world. Like it's horrifying.
That sucks. That just plain sucks.
I love how creative they are. Like I've said in reference specifically to like the weird solutions to things that they come up with, like there's something really evocative about them, even though like logistically I don't buy it for a second. Like the simplicity of it, like they feel so elegant and simple, and yet they're so strong. Like the solutions, these punishments, like everything about it, and like we don't have those anymore. Like with novels, especially you're expected to go into all this detail about things because that's how you write, I guess. But there is like just, I don't know, a beautiful simplicity to laying down like a solution or a way something is, and then just carrying on, which may just be an artifact of like how stories were told then as opposed to how stories are told now. But I still love it. Yeah.
And also it's interesting to note that here too, we see these people, these men, with these horrific punishments happening. The poet here spends zero time telling us why. Yeah. It's assumed that every audience member would know these stories, know what the deal is. Yeah. So that's just boom, boom, boom. And again, and then we if there's any comments we can go back, but and then all of a sudden he sees Heracles, and then it's like, okay, that's it, we're out, done.
Yeah, so I was about to say that. So, like, the last person we talked to was Heracles, who basically is just like, I was the son of Zeus and my pain was infinite. I had to do all these labors, bye! Yeah. And that's it. And then all of these shades kind of converge on Odysseus, and he's like, I am freaked out, let's get the fuck out of here. Yeah. So there are a couple of interesting things happening here with Heracles. First, when he's first introduced in the scene and Odysseus sees him, like, and Heracles is scary, like he's running down, he looks like he's about to attack something, and the poet is very specific to mention that Odysseus sees Heracles, but he recognizes this is just the ghost of Heracles, because there's a really famous story that when Heracles died, the gods split him into two, and the more divine part went up to Olympus to live with the gods forever and marry Hebe and all this other stuff. But he was part human though, so part of him did have to go down in the underworld, and that's the part that Odysseus is seeing here. I did not know that. Yeah, that makes this even weird. Crazier. Yeah, if that was even possible. That really doesn't ever happen to anyone else other than Heracles, but it seems like it's like a retcon, because there had been so many ancient stories about Heracles in the underworld, but then other people had stories about him in Mount Olympus. So like, well, we got to figure this out somewhere. He was split into two. There we go. That makes sense. Interesting. All right.
That's why it's so weird when I think about like when we think about like say Star Wars, we think about like what's canon and what's not and stuff. But how we engage with what is or isn't like really part of the story is like is so confounded. Like the biggest thing for me was the whole Iphigenia thing with Agamemnon.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen in the Iliad, right? He still has all three of his daughters. Iphigenia is Iphianassa, and that just isn't like a part of like that thing that he did in that story isn't a part of who he is in this. So which one is it, right? How are we supposed to engage with how we understand Agamemnon as a person? And you saying that his soul being split in two, being like some retcon, makes me think of like how like how uncomfortable like the storytellers were with human sacrifice. Like, oh, like maybe Iphigenia survived,
Right.
maybe she'll whatever, or she went willingly. And in the Iliad, it seems like it just isn't there altogether. And that's just something we have to deal with.
Yeah. And so this is where book 11 very abruptly cuts off.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say very briefly to wrap up that part. So I because Heracles is so abrupt of an appearance, I think this, like with the Parade of Women, that this is also a place where the poet could have included other transgressors, lengthened this, shortened this. We don't hear about Ixion, for example, like the other really famous one, Ixion on his wheel. So we got to wrap this up. Okay, and Heracles shows up. And then, in his little speech, he talks about how, when I was doing the labors, I had to go into the underworld to get Cerberus and go back, and that was almost impossible. And it's basically like, here's the signal: get out while you can get out, get while the going's good. And then Odysseus is like, oh crap, there are all of these shades around. I'm out of here.
Yeah, and so
he's pushing his luck by being there.
Tells the men to untie the boat, get in. We're leaving the station. We're getting the fuck out of here. And that is where we leave off with book 11. And this is where we'll take a brief little intermission to refresh ourselves. And when we come back, we will get into book 12. So we will see you all very soon.
Hello, dear listener. We hope you've enjoyed listening to the first part of this episode of Homer Bound. There's more to come afterward, but I'd like to take a moment on this break to say a few special thank yous. First, thank you for listening. This podcast has no sponsor. Everything is produced in-house, on our own time, and fueled by our own interests. Sharing in our interests means a great deal to us, and knowing that others enjoy the content means even more. Please follow us on our Twitter at Homer_bound for new episodes, or just keep an eye on the podcast page, wherever you happen to be listening. I'd like to give another special thank you to my friend Llama for hosting the show with me, and I'd like to thank the composer and performer of the music you've been hearing during the transitions, who has said he'd like to be known simply as Llama's father. Thank you, Llama's father. I'd also like to thank Bubbo for her contributions to the audio, Webs2D for some original art, and Total Love for additional art and graphic design, and Ghosty also for additional graphic design. Another special thank you to our numerous guests for lending us their time and expertise, and a last but not least thank you to Dr. Daniel, who anchors every one of our episodes with his insights on our discussions. We appreciate his time and energy, and we encourage you to stick around at the end of the episode to make sure you hear what he has to say. Please consider reading along with us as you listen. We are reading the Emily Wilson translation, and while reading the text isn't necessary for you to follow along, you'll likely get more out of our discussions if you have. Feel free to pause and return later if you wish to do so. Okay, thanks for sticking through our break. I'll give it back to me and Llama on Homer Bound.
And we're back. I have refreshed my tea as per usual. I'm back on that tropical tea again that I had, I think, several episodes ago. It's delicious. I may have thrown a little bit of rum in there, made myself a little bit of a hot toddy, and I'm hoping that both of you have also, hopefully refreshed your beverages, maybe had a little bit of a stretch a bio break if
I
you
have
needed
a
one.
red solo cup with powdered Gatorade. There's the powder has obviously been mixed with water, but that is the result of that.
No, he's
is
just
what I'm
drinking
drinking.
Powder. He's
Excellent. Just powder.
sitting there and
It's
drinking powder.
I'm
a
not,
little
I'm not,
dry.
I'm not
That, like,
drinking
made
unmixed
me feel
Gatorade,
dry.
okay?
Just thinking about it, I don't like that. Mixed with water
I too,
sounds great.
I have flavored water because I can't bring myself to drink regular water, so I gotta use a little bit of the Mio.
All
give it a little
right.
flavor.
Which flavor? Just out of curiosity.
This one is it's some kind of punch.
Ooh,
I
nice.
alternate, so I
Great.
I have red and blue, and so I drink a cup of red, then a cup of blue, then a cup of
I
red.
think that red and blue are both like perfectly like if someone asks you what a flavor of thing that you're drinking is, red flavor is
Yes.
the accurate description.
Yeah. Yep.
So we've got some red flavor water. We've got some powdered mixed Gatorade, and
This is orange flavored.
Orange flavored. All right, and I've got my little
Both a color and a flavor.
my little tropical hot toddy. So I think it's safe to say that we're all ready for some more fun talking about Book 12 of the Odyssey, which is aptly called Difficult Choices.
Yeah.
So many choices.
Actually, before we went back on, I was talking a little bit with Scott in our previous conversation that we had. It was a couple months ago. He was talking about how much he hates Odysseus and how terrible a person he is. And you mentioned that reapproaching this book since last time you read it, you've thought about him a little bit differently. And this book title that Dr. Emily Wilson has chosen, Difficult Choices. That's how I think that's a really good title, especially when we're trying to figure out how to evaluate Odysseus's decisions in this particular book.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I've in my latest rereading of the Odyssey, I've read it many times over the years, but I did find myself a little bit more sympathetic to Odysseus, and the things that he's forced to deal with. How he treats people based on his experiences, I think is an interesting way to look at him. I mean, he's still kind of a dick, but
he is he is for sure, and he gets in his own way like all the time, and just like, especially, we've said this a couple times now, the Polyphemus episode where he just has to rub it in on his way out, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, dude, really?
And as you said, he gives him his name and address.
Yeah, I pointed that out. What I love most about that, like, him having to rub it in, is not only does he have to rub it in, but he's like, my name is Odysseus. I live on this island. Come fight me, bro. And it's just hilarious. Like, you're really gonna give this giant freaking Cyclops, which, like, admittedly, you have blinded, so maybe he's at a disadvantage now. Like, you gave him your name and address. Why?
But that was the big part where I was like, Odysseus can't be like spinning all this out of nowhere, because like, for one thing, he said that his crew said, "Hey, stop it," and then he depicts himself as having gone on anyway, and this leads to, like, if you're even a mildly interested reader in what he's saying, you get what he's putting down. Like, this was a mistake.
Yeah, I should not have done this.
It's not about this time that I began to regret some of my decisions.
Right. Speaking of regrets, let's check out Book 12.
Book 12 is full of them. I mean, really, like, Odysseus' entire story is full of regrets because of the boneheaded things that either he or his crew does.
Or his crew.
And, like, he makes sure to point out many times that his crew are, like, schmucks. They're not the brightest bulbs in the box. They're not they're missing a couple of colors of the crayons. And so they set out from the underworld and they go back to Circe's island. And Circe's like, oh my god, you survived that? And, like, that's super cool because, like, then you'll die twice. Huh.
Right. So yeah, I didn't really expect you to come back, but cool.
Right, which I find hilarious because she sends them off there and she's like, okay, this is what you do, this is how you do it, everything is gonna be fine, and then they come back and she's just like, oh wow, you actually did make it back. Impressive. And one of the first things they do is, as promised, they bury Elpenor. They give him his
Yep.
funeral rites. They send him off properly, as he had really begged them to do.
Yes, very very important. Had to do it. It was part of the deal to get into the underworld and back, even if it wasn't explicit in the language.
Yeah, and it's the idea that you have this sacrifice, and the sacrifice has now asked you to complete the ritual that he has been
Yep.
sacrificed for, which, when you think about it, is kind of, I mean, not even kind of, it's wild. Like, that is wild that you basically end up, like, sacrificing this person, and then the sacrifice, get to ask you to, like, complete the ritual.
It's all sorts of creepy.
There's a lot of really creepy shit going on, especially, I mean, in the last book, just quite a bit. Not only in the sense of, the stories that are told with the women, but also just in the sense of, like, the environment of the underworld, the shades, how, like, put off by it Odysseus is. And so now he's almost kind of come back to a place of comfort, if there was one, because he's back in what he kind of knows to be the safety of Circe's Island. But then is given, so this is the point where he's given the second set of directions to get himself back home, which will lead to, basically, like, Benny Hill hijinks levels of, you can hear the music. I can hear, like, or like the circus music, dee 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 dee. So Circe gives him directions, and I'm gonna distill them, but obviously if you guys want to talk at any point, and we'll get into more detail about what is supposed to happen versus what actually happens. So she tells Odysseus the route that he has to take to get home. I mean, basically, he has to go past the Sirens, the island of the Sirens, and, like, none of his men can listen to the music. He's told to plug up all of their ears with wax, but that he alone can listen to it as long as they, like, strap him to the mast of the ship. And if he begs to be let go so that he can hear more of it, they have to strap him down even harder.
If you'll allow me to tackle this one, and when I say tackle, in my mind, I do imagine myself, like, flying in from off screen and tackling.
I was gonna say, like, do you mean that literally? Apparently, yes.
Literally and figuratively. But I will not do it literally here. The siren thing is, well, for one thing, when I was younger, this is, like, one of the first encounters that I had with Odysseus, with the Odyssey. Like, this is one of those things that's depicted most regularly in, like, children's books or like other similarly, like, distilled versions of the Odyssey. There's Cyclops and there's the sirens, and you remember, like, the multi-headed creature. But one thing that I find interesting, or weird even, about this passage is that, at least as it's rendered, Circe says you can listen to the sirens, but Odysseus, later, when we actually get to the sirens, Circe says I should listen to the sirens, which is, I don't know, like, why? Why is he doing this?
He's so, some people say that Odysseus is still sort of trying to shed himself of the Iliad style hero, but he's still got it. So he's like, I've got to be the one. I'm the only one who gets to do this. I'm going to experience this, even though the rest of you can't. I'm going to have this glory to my name, essentially. But yeah, so essentially, yeah, what happens here is Odysseus spends one more night with Circe, one last hurrah, and then she tells him, and then she pulls Odysseus aside very specifically, away from earshot of any of his men, and she goes through all these instructions. And then right after that, we hear Odysseus' men go through these things that she's just described. So it's very similar text. But yes, there are some interesting differences. And yeah, that's the first big one. She says in this translation, but if you yourself are wanting to hear them, then have them tie you, blah, blah, blah. But then when he's describing, he says, yep, exactly. And Circe says, I'm gonna listen, and I'm going to experience this thing you guys aren't.
So I don't know what Odysseus or anyone else really knows about the sirens. I actually feel like it would be kind of impossible to really know anything about them. Kind of in the same way, like, well, if no one's in it was in Pirates of the Caribbean when Jack Sparrow's like, oh, if there are no survivors, then how does anyone know anything about them? It's like,
Sure.
I don't know. But what is there about that? Like, why does he want to hear theirs? Is it just for the glory, or is there like we can think of like plenty of instances where we've indulged in like one pleasure or another, knowing the dangers, but enticed by like what like in this one it's like it's such a strong feeling that like people will go directly to their deaths. So like from that perspective, hearing the siren song must be like some immensely pleasurable experience, even if it would result in your death. Right?
Especially what Cersei says is like, for the sirens, it's not really death. It's this is around line 40. If anyone goes near them in ignorance and listens to their voices, that man will never travel to his home, and never make his wife and children happy to have him back with him again. This is like the crux of what this journey is about, is to get Odysseus home. So it's like,
we've run into stuff like this before.
Of all the things to tempt fate about, like, you are really going out there on this one. But it's, I mean, I don't know. For me, I would just be like, this is sheer curiosity. Like, what could be so crazy powerful and beautiful about this song to make you never want to go home again?
Well, it's weird that Cersei would even present him with this option. If we think back to like the Lotus Eaters, you know, right. Odysseus didn't say, "Okay, tie me down and feed me this fruit." Like he just he's like, "Okay, let's go, let's get out of here," you know. But this time he's like, it's like when you're flirting with that, like on the edge, right? Like he's it's. Yeah, and I mean, he just finished spending like a year, remember, like with Cersei. So like there probably some like doubts or some weird feelings about going back home. I mean, it obviously still wants to get home, but like all of the characters in like all of these Greek myths that we've examined, like no one is just one thing. You know, Odysseus isn't just like, I just want to get home and that's all I am. He would struggle with like the human experience of like being tired or being depressed or
I think in this case being curious,
or like how much easier it would be to like stay home, just to like not pursue this anymore.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, he certainly enjoyed other temptations along the way, so why not try this one?
Yeah, that too. Yeah
And it is interesting to note that a lot of sort of modern day depictions of sirens have them as beautiful women. Here we get nothing, no description of them whatsoever, other than it's just their song specifically that entices men. And it's worth noting that in actual ancient Greek art, sirens are typically depicted as birds with the heads of women on them, and that's it.
That's wild. That's wild.
So
that's so cool.
So this idea that they're
like, I've always kind of imagined them as almost kind of like ugly monster-like, and they kind of like lure you to their island with their like beautiful voices, and once you're there, they're like, no, I'm gonna eat you, or like whatever, you know,
like fanged mermaids or something like that,
or something like that. Absolutely, I think that's a pretty like popular depiction, I want to say, even. But yeah, it's fascinating that like you really don't get any description of them at all.
Yeah.
Okay, and so now Cersei presents him with the big choice, which is like not really a choice because both options completely suck.
Yeah.
You want to go back
real
to
briefly? Yeah, just real briefly before that are the rocks, the rovers, sometimes they're translated. So they're these rocks that just crash together, and you just kind of got to avoid them. This is an interesting thing because it's so briefly mentioned here, but it plays a fairly large role in the Argonautica. So again, like a later
Jason
epic
Who,
poem.
like one guy made up there, right?
And it even mentions that directly.
Yeah. So there's like the only seagoing ship to get through was the Argo. So when we get like the full story of the Argonautica later, like that fills in all of the details and cool exploits about these
So one of the
rocks.
things that we've talked about like a number of times are like how many spin-offs there are
Hmm.
to both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we've kind of talked about it in the context of like there have been times where someone has been mentioned so in detail that you're like, there's another story about this guy. You
Yep.
know, like the adventures of Diomedes and Idomeneus and you know, all so like this is I think yet another one of those spin-offs where you get this little tease of Jason and the Argonauts, but
Yeah.
it's really kind
Yeah.
of left to your imagination and just passed over as a glancing topic for the moment, but it leads into this choice.
Yes.
Scylla?
That's what most modern people say. I mean, it would be a hard K. Traditionally, it would be Scylla,
Scylla?
but Scylla's
Okay.
fine. It's fine. It's totally fine.
I know I looked that up and I've forgotten it every single time I looked it up in the glossary because my brain just wants it to be Scylla.
Yeah, it's
So
all good.
we'll go with that. It's fine. Whose voice is puppy-like, but she is dangerous, is how it's rendered in the Emily Wilson translation.
I implore you to read it. So it's just before line 90, but to read how she is actually described because it is amazing.
Yes,
This monster is
There lives Scylla, howling and barking horribly. Her voice is puppy-like, but she is dangerous. Even a god would be afraid of her. She has 12 dangling legs and 6 long necks with a gruesome head on each, and in each face 3 rows of crowded teeth, pregnant with death. Her belly slumps inside the hollow cave. She keeps her head above the yawning chasm and scopes around the rock and hunts for fish. That's terrifying.
yikes. Yeah, she is that's a crazy monster. Anyway,
Yeah.
whoever the hell thought of this up, she's got 12 legs, she's got 6 heads, she's got a big furry body. It's gross.
That sounds
This-
like a puppy.
This is exactly the trolley problem, which I'm going to assume everyone at home knows. Trolley's heading toward 5 people tied up to a tracks. You have the option of pulling the lever and switch it to the other track, but there's one person there. Do you pull the lever or not? And this is like exactly that. Because Odysseus is being presented with, okay, all of you will die, or only some of you will die, and now you have to choose. And the choice is obvious, but it's still a choice you have to make.
Right. So you have to choose between the Wandering Rocks, where people are definitely going to die, no human ship has ever passed, or you have to go past this cave where there's a 12 legs, 6-headed, multi-road teeth beast who are like also definitely going to kill you. Like, and there's question as to whether you will be able to pass that alive either. And Odysseus's response to this is like, do I have to choose? And Circe kind of just verbally slaps him back with like, you're still obsessed with war and glory, but this is where you surrender to the gods. This, like, you know now that you have been meant to suffer. This is the suffering part.
Yeah. So you've got this horrible monster, then the Charybdis, which is some kind of a whirlpool that sucks things down and then spits them back up again. But yeah, it's you if you go that way, everybody will die. If you go past Scylla, at least only 6 will die because her 6 heads will grab 1 person each. So good luck with that.
And it's funny.
And yeah, I mean,
sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, and yeah, I mean, here Odysseus, he's trying to, whether it's for his own glory or not, he is trying to say, well, is there a way I can save all of my men rather than know that 6 will die?
Yeah,
And it seems as though he does have like a legitimate whether it's like duty bound or like purely humanly altruistic, it's hard to say, but he does have like a legitimate, probably earnest affection, if not need, for his crew, where although even because when he gets the report that Circe has turned half of his men into pigs and he's warned of the danger, he's like, no, I have to do this, and he goes, not knowing like what he's going to get into, which is like, I don't think something he had to do. Like, he could have left, but he chose not to. But thinking more about like this as like being presented as like a trolley problem without the trolley, and instead terrors at sea, Odysseus's response is very similar to like what a lot of people will say, like, "Oh, can I derail the trolley?
Right.
Can I like save everything? Can I not choose?" And but that's not the point of the problem. The problem is that a choice must be made, even if you don't choose. You're making a decision. And so when Cersei sort of claps back, that's kind of like the asker of the question, if they understand the question, will say, no, the point isn't that you can stop the trolley. You have to make one choice or the other. And that seems to be what she's saying. Like, you can't outwit this one. This is just one or the other, and you have to deal with that.
Yeah, because he also asked, well, can we arm up and try to fight Scylla?
Yeah,
and she's like, no, you just stop.
No,
just
this
stop
is,
asking.
This is a pointless
There's
question.
nothing.
But wait, there's more. Because there is more. Because next they are told, he is told that after making this really awful choice, that he will have to go to the island of Helios, the sun god, and who herds sheep and cattle, and don't touch the cows. No matter what you do, don't touch the cows. He really likes those cows.
He loves them.
He loves those cows. And she basically foretells that, if you don't touch the cows, you'll get home to Ithaca. If you do kill any of these cows, like, if you make it home, it will be after a serious whooping.
Yeah, and Tiresias had basically said the same thing in the previous chapter too, and it was one of those if then statements. So it was like, okay, this is a possible future. Maybe this is something that Odysseus can get out of, and we will see him try fairly hard to avoid this fate for his men, a couple different ways.
Yeah,
I guess. Well, yeah. I mean, we'll talk. We'll go through. I guess we talked about what happens with the sirens, but we can talk about the Scylla and Charybdis episode.
Let's talk about Odysseus's relationship with his crew, because we're given these directions, and Cersei, sends them off with a friendly little wind, and then this is the part where Odysseus is like, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going on, but I'm not going to tell you all of what's going on. And this is what Wriste was talking about before in this first example with the sirens, where instead of her saying, you should decide whether you want to listen to the sirens or not, he says, Cersei has said that I alone must listen to the sirens. Tie me down, boys. And
let's do this thing. Yeah.
And this next decision that he makes is a lot less innocent. Not innocent in the sense that I think Odysseus is guilty, because this is a weird decision anyone would have to make. But he doesn't tell his crew about
the giant monster.
Yeah, right. And he purposely does not. Yeah.
And his reasoning that he gives is that if he tells them, they'll never go through. They'll never want to go. They might risk. How do you pronounce this thing's name? Charybdis.
Yeah.
Charybdis. They might choose to risk Charybdis and get them all killed. Perhaps that's me reading into it. I don't think he actually says that, but he does say like they might panic, which is, I mean, Odysseus has, as we've said, Odysseus has a very particular way of looking at people. He has a kind of cynical way of looking at people, which is that when backed into a corner, or it seems like he thinks that when people when backed into a corner will basically look out for themselves only, and
because that's what he would do.
Like they'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll disobey your orders, whatever. And as shitty as this decision is, I find it really hard to blame him for doing this.
He's not wrong.
It's the least awful way, even though he takes agency away from all of his men, which is,
I mean, he is the commander. Yeah, I mean, there's also an aspect to it is that he also worries about people just failing him, right? That they're not gonna, that if they're armed with too much information, they'll decide their own fate, which might go against what he knows is the best thing to do. But again, like even here though, where we're around line 225. So in this translation, for my part, I let go from my mind the difficult instruction that Cersei had given me, for she told me not to be armed for combat, but I put on my glorious armor, and taking up 2 long spears in my hands, I stood bestriding the vessel's foredeck. So he is going to try. He knows he can't. Right, he can't tell his crew because that would just freak them out completely. He can't have them armed because they need to be able to row and react quickly.
Mhm.
But he's going to get armored up, and he's going to try to take Scylla on if he can, which is not going to go well.
She's just too scary. Is it like he sees her and his heart just sinks or something?
Yeah. There's no way. And I wanted to mention here. So there's an interesting thing that. So we think of, in modern times, we think of the ancient Greeks as great sailors, right? They had sailing ships, they depicted boats and all their things, they're great heroes go on sailing voyages. But when we read about like firsthand accounts of ancient Greeks, they were scared to death of the ocean. The ocean was
I mean,
full
in
of terror.
fairness to them,
I mean,
the ocean is fucking
Absolutely.
terrifying, and it remains terrifying today. Like,
yeah. So for the most part, when we actually look at like how did ancient people sail, they sailed just far enough off of the water to be able to get the good winds, but they always tried to sail where they could see the land and not go further than that.
Yeah.
So when we think,
sure.
when we see things here like Charybdis, like in the middle of the ocean, there's this giant whirlpool that sucks things down and blows up, and then there are bits of ships. Like this is a reflection of like this primal fear of the ocean and how it can just annihilate ships. And like, because you have to think there were boats on the water, and then inevitably, the tide would bring in bits and pieces, and they have to imagine like how
what
did the ship
happened
get
to
destroyed?
these people?
Yeah.
I can only imagine, like, and I think that's honestly, like, in a lot of these stories where these monsters come from is, like, not even really who thought it up, but, like, this is kind of backtracking in a very creative way from things that happened where people would just disappear, and you would get bits and pieces of what happened to them, maybe, but then you have to kind of take creative license thinking of not only how to explain why they're gone, but also how to warn people from doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So like this is something you tell the kids, like, oh, if you ever go out on a boat like that, the big, slurping geyser monster of the ocean is going to suck you up and spit you out. Like, then your kids are not going to be like, let's go play in the ocean. The ocean is dangerous,
Yeah, exactly. And so the six get snatched by Scylla. And that's the end of that.
Yummy.
I'm curious.
Snacks for Scylla.
So Scott, you mentioned when we were talking, like, this is kind of a part where you're like, this is where Odysseus like does like stuff that you don't like. Why don't you dig into that just a little bit? I'm really curious because again, when we spoke, you were quite passionate about how your feelings about Odysseus. So I'm just curious, I suppose.
Well, I mean, part of my dislike for Odysseus is because I'm such a fan of Ajax. So that's a big part that's built in. But so already at this point in the book, though, we've had numerous occasions where Odysseus gets bitten in the ass because he wasn't upfront with his crew. I mean, we can see this especially in the Bag of Winds. Like, if he had just told them in advance what was going on, I mean, who knows?
And
maybe
he also
didn't, but at
doesn't
least,
listen to directions.
Right. And so here again, like, he's got to be the only one who knows everything. Yes, he has his reasons for not telling them about Scylla and Charybdis, because it'll scare the shit out of them, and who knows what they'll do. But then, especially though, when we get to Thrinakia, though, it's just like
Peleus and the cows.
You could have supplied them with a little bit more information. Tried to persuade them to your way of thinking, rather than just be like, well, so that happened.
Yeah, well, you could be explicit with them and say, like, if you eat one of these cows, we're all gonna die.
I think, doesn't he say that eventually?
He does eventually, but then we have to think, okay, so from these crewmen's perspective, look at all this stuff that Odysseus never told them,
right?
And all the problems that happened because of it. So it's the boy who cried wolf at that time. It's like, or at that point, sort of reversed.
It's
but
also like
why are we going to listen to you now?
It's a bit late in the game to finally be telling them, like, you're going to die if this happens. They're like, all right, but we've already been here for a while. All the supplies are gone. We're starving. Like, what do you want us to do, bro? Now you're telling us this, but why are you only telling us this now? Like, no,
and we are And we are one ship of men. There used to be many ships.
Right.
And everyone else
is dead.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All my friends are dead. You know?
Yeah.
Just he gets in his way so much, and it's like so frustrating. And you do kind of get some of the reasons why he does this. But then there's times where you're just like, oh my god, just tell them. What's wrong with you?
It's one of those things where like Odysseus, like this is his standard mode of operation. As I said, he's like fairly cynical about people. You know, he's like, if I could tell them this, then they could do something like this, or they could do something like that. And so he just chooses to operate in this way. And of course, this does bite him in the ass. But also, I don't know if Odysseus lacks the wisdom to know when he needs to like trust people or when
Sure.
not to. Because, like, I mean, the opposite way would be equally hazardous, right? If you're just upfront with everyone about everything that is going on, then you are giving up like a significant amount of like power over the other person. You're like when Odysseus lied to the Cyclops about like the fact that he has no ships. I don't have any ships. They crashed.
Yeah.
Or he did Nazca a solid by saying, "Oh, I was too shy," like that sort of thing. Where like this seems like a fairly positive, if not neutral, outcome. Like if he was like a truth teller, like things could turn out really differently, right? Maybe he wouldn't get the same kind of help that he wants, or he would be in significantly more danger. Yeah, I don't know how to evaluate Odysseus's mindset, especially since, like, just bring it to the modern day. We would never trust a stranger in the same way that like Xenia would ask us to do. Like, obviously the way travel works is different, but even still, if like a stranger shows up at your house and asks for a place to stay, you shut the door and lock it, and you call the police. But that's like that's what Odysseus sees, I think. It's weird because like he exists in this world where he's dependent on like the goodwill of strangers, but he has like he's very skeptical of others in the way that I think is like pretty relatable and common to us now. So it's like, on one hand, I want to say, you know, Odysseus is like shooting himself in the foot, and on the other hand, I think he sees things really clearly, so clearly that it may, in one way or another, be blinding him to like good decisions, like, you know, trusting your crew and being upfront and honest with them, having a good relationship with them, which it doesn't seem like he really has.
I also think it's interesting to me, like, it seems like he does a lot better when he's on his own than when he is leading a group. Like, for what it's worth, he's a very effective warrior, he's very cunning, he's very witty, but he's not the best leader.
Well, and also looking at it sort of from the beginning to the end of the Odyssey, and even some of the Iliad, all of this is training Odysseus for all of the challenges that he's going to face once he gets home. Because then we're going to see just tons of lying and tricks, and who do I tell what, and how do I give out the truth so that I can accomplish all the things I need to do when I'm almost completely on my own in, you know, my home, but what is essentially like an alien battlefield. In a lot of ways,
honing the blade, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Honing and sharpening that blade so that when he does finally need to strike, he can do it decisively and execute it perfectly, which he basically does.
I was going to say, like, the way we evaluate Odysseus's conduct, like, I think changes once he gets to Ithaca, where he does have to, like, lie and be cautious and have this like heightened suspicion of like everyone around him, because it's been 20 years since he's been home. Like,
although I
like,
do
he has
find
no idea.
I do find it really interesting that it is as soon as he gets home that he is in possession of like all of his faculties and is able to, like, he's back in his element, really, because he has finally found home. This thing that I think part of it is just like, you get the sense that like when he is in all of these foreign lands and areas, and like that element of home is missing to him. He's off balance. So that may even be tinkering with that internal compass of his. of just like the foreignness of his situation.
Yeah, I mean, arguably Odysseus is he's very strategic. He works best when he knows the lay of the land. He has all the information. He's not necessarily he's not like Achilles, who I guess would be more of a tactical character who can react to anything and fight in any circumstance. Yeah, so that would tie into, when he gets home, he knows where everything is. He interrogates everybody, but obviously we'll get to that later.
We will get to that later.
Yeah.
But what I would love to talk about now is we get to the Sun God's Island, and of course things, as are predictable by this point, go terribly, terribly wrong. He doesn't tell his men really why until it's too late.
I think he tells them before they eat it, right? Like he tells them.
He does.
At first he says, "Don't touch the cows," and then he says,
point,
"These are the cows of Helios."
The wheels are already in motion. The supplies are dwindling. The men are hungry. Desperation is in the air, and
so as soon as they get past Scylla and Charybdis, and then they come across the island Thrinacia, and then around 270 he does say, "Then sorrowful as I was, I spoke and told my companions, listen to what I say, my companions, though you are suffering evils, while I tell you the prophecies of Tiresias and Circe. Both have told me many times over to avoid the island of Helios, who brings joy to mortals, blah, 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 blah." So he's telling them, pass by the island, don't stop here. And then, of course, they're like, dude, we just need a break. There's this great looking island right here. Please let us stop there. And then they do. And then, of course, immediately the weather changes and they can't get off. And so for a while, first Odysseus makes them promise that they won't kill the cattle. And at that point, it's easy for them to do because they've got a storehouse full of all these goodies that Circe packed up for them. And then even once that's gone, there's other things that they can hunt and fish on the island, so they're good for a while longer. But then it's when all of that runs out.
And then, of course, it's always
dire straits.
It's always when Odysseus goes to sleep.
Right.
When Odysseus and sleep, they do not get along well, because as tired as he is, every time he closes his eyes for more than 20 seconds, his men screw the pooch.
You cannot leave them alone for 2 minutes.
And what happens next is disturbing.
It is. And so first off, it's interesting to note that his men, so they don't even his men who don't fully trust Odysseus, they're mad at what he has told them, hasn't told them. It's not that they completely disregard his words, right? They go into this very carefully. They wait till they're It's not like, they don't choose to do this right at the beginning. It's when they are completely out of other options. And they try to do what they can. They even say, look, they beseech the gods. They do this as best they can in the manner of a proper sacrifice. And they're saying, look, please, we're trying to do what we can, but we need this to survive. And then Helios finds out and is big mad about the loss of his cattle, and goes to Zeus to have them punished.
Yeah, and then we get some serious zombie cow action as these guys are cooking the meat up, and Odysseus smells it and is just like, oh crap. This is what happens. This is at line 390. It did no good. The cows were dead already. The gods sent signs. The hides began to twitch. The meat on skewers started mooing, raw and cooked. There was a sound of cattle lowing. And then, they feast on this beef for 6 days, and Zeus basically vows to make all of their lives and deaths a living hell.
Yeah, it's not good. So I mean that's hard the poor end.
This part, I wonder whose fault is this?
Yes,
it's. I mean, I would say no. This doesn't feel like anyone's. It's so hard to blame at the feet of anyone. I guess the worst would probably be Euryclus,
Eurylochus.
Eurylochus. Yeah, there it is. Eurylochus, the naysayer who keeps appearing, who keeps. I guess he's probably works as a stand-in for the crew to express doubt about Odysseus.
Yeah.
As like a number of
Yeah,
characters do, like
questioning.
Rubin does this, and now we have this guy. But even then, like his reasoning for things is not like totally bad. Like he doesn't like you shouldn't trust Odysseus totally. Who knows why he's saying what he's saying? And you might lay that at the feet of Odysseus. Then like, oh, like you don't have the trust of your crew, so by your actions or by the way you conduct yourself, this is why this has happened. But Odysseus kind of in some ways has to be this way. It's caused problems, and it's also been the reason they survived this long. So it's like it's very much the all or something sort of choice that Odysseus is always making, where he like makes these little sacrifices to keep on going. So yeah, I don't know where like if we're even supposed to walk away from this saying, oh, this is this guy's bad, or this is their bad. I don't know exactly where the buck stops.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is sort of at fault to some degree or another, but at the same time, everybody had their reasons for why this ended up being the case. Yeah, and I think depending on when you read this and who you identify with, you'll have a different answer for that.
I think that answer also could kind of change every time you read it, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I still choose to say yes because I think they're all idiots. They were catching fish and birds. They had something to live on. Not much. They tried.
Yeah, they tried for a while.
I don't even blame him for eating the cows. Like, it makes sense. Like, because he was like, I'd rather die by the gods than like die slowly by starving. You know, which
I don't think many people would enjoy starving to death. I certainly would not.
No. Yeah, that doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, it's like a very sound decision. Like it make and they expressed this knowledge about all of this stuff, right? Like they knew what was at stake. It wasn't even like Odysseus could have been more upfront with them sooner about it, but when they made the decision, they knew, right? Like they knew the consequences, and they made that choice against other choices.
It is a little weird. Oh. Yeah,
sorry.
It is a little weird. So Odysseus goes to sleep. They have this plot. They slaughter the animals. They start to eat it. Odysseus wakes up. He comes out. He's like, "What the fuck, guys? What have you done?" He sees this. There are all these weird portents about the animals coming back to life, and then they're still hanging out for 6 more days before they get on the ship and leave.
Chilling there, feasting, saying like, "Oh yeah, no, it's gonna be okay. We'll just build a little shrine and it'll be fine."
Yeah, like what is Odysseus
delicious.
doing?
Have you had any?
Yeah, what is Odysseus doing for those 6 days? How is he interacting with anybody? Is he just off by himself? Like, screw you guys, you're toast, but I'm hopefully gonna make it out of this. How did those days go down? That's what I want to know.
Well, the reason why they didn't leave was because they didn't have the winds at their backs, right?
Right. Yeah. The weather still didn't clear up for another week.
And then like for 6 days they eat the cows, and the 7th day they get a wind that like seems promising, and
which is really kind of Zeus just opening the door for him to royally fuck their shit up.
Yeah, in the same way that Zeus lured Agamemnon to Troy only to bring him ruin, he sends a wind that seems pretty good, and they head out, and you know that's why Odysseus is alone now.
Yeah.
Zeus.
Yeah, so the storm comes up.
Wrecks everything.
Yep. They all die, and then he escapes on a little piece of ship, and then makes it to Calypso, and then
and we finally come full
wraps
circle.
it back up.
Yeah.
There was one thing I wanted to point out about Scylla. This just stood out to me because it's such a change from the Iliad. Nobody in the Iliad dies nameless. Everyone is given like a name and a little bit of history. You get like a peek into their inner lives, and then like they're dead. But we don't get that with Scylla or even like all the other suitors. When Odysseus kills them, plenty of suitors like die nameless, and Odysseus's crew, for the most part, we don't know who they are. Like we have a couple stand-ins. We have the dead guy. We have
Elpenor. We have
Eurylochus.
Eurylochus.
Yeah, Eurylochus, and that's kind of it. I don't know if there's anything more to say about that, but it surprised me when I didn't hear about these men. Even though it's Odysseus telling the story, it still seems like if we fast forward to the suitors, like the same sort of thing happens, where it's like we have Eurylochus.
You have
Eurylochus, and it was another guy.
Elpenor?
Also. No, it was.
Of the suitors.
Yeah.
We
have the super asshole.
You're talking about
then,
Antilochus
and then the one who's not quite as bad as the rest of them.
I don't think his name is Antilochus, because that's the name of Nestor's son who's dead.
Antinous.
Antinous, that's it. It. It was an anti-name.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember.
So many names.
Yeah.
But like we know there's like his halls are like crowded with suitors. And like when he kills them, we don't get the same sort of treatment, and I don't know. It just stood out to me as different.
Yeah.
I think for me, it might be a little bit that like in the Iliad, which is such a story about war and glory, it serves the story to mention each of those people. It serves the sense of what is to be won and lost. Whereas I think in the Odyssey, like with the suitors, like it's not about them. They're there to serve a purpose, which is to heighten the glory of Odysseus coming back home and taking back what is his. So he's the name that we want to hear about. Him and Telemachus are the names that we want to hear about. It's not that same sense of like them fitting into those places where you see what is won and lost on the battlefield. They just get got. Like,
yeah. Well, and too with the crewmen who die nameless, it does sort of fulfill what we saw in the Iliad. Like Odysseus does great things. He has glory. His name is going to be remembered. These other guys, not so much.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how to. I'm still not sure how to think about that. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'll recount a fairly recent tragedy. I don't know if this would like be a problem for anyone, but spoilers or not spoilers. Just a warning. I'm going to talk about a fairly recent tragedy. We all remember when it was Kobe Bryant and his daughter died in a helicopter accident. But there were other people in there, and we'll never. I mean, their names are out there, of course, but nobody is going to talk about them, of course, because they're not Kobe Bryant. And like that's not a condemnation of it. It's just the way it works, right? Like he was a modern day hero, I guess. But all those other like I don't know, like it bothered me when I heard that. It's not like it's not like a condemnation of anything. It's just like kind of incidental. Like those people just happened to be in the same helicopter as Kobe when it went down. But his like that story's gonna be remembered with his name, and that's kind of what's happening in the Odyssey. Like Odysseus is the unluckiest man alive. He doesn't die, but everyone else dies. But this is Odysseus's story,
right?
And so we were not gonna really know who else was there with him. It's this. It feels like the same. It gives me the same kind of feeling.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it does it. I think that is an apt parallel for sure. Yeah. One thing that I noted that was just interesting, the way you divided up the books for this podcast series, but books 11 and 12 are bookended with the sun. So in book 11, we get Odysseus immediately going to the land of the Cimmerians, where it says the sun does not shine. And book 12 ends with Helios being so powerful, he threatens Zeus with overturning the natural order of things, shining the sun in the underworld, and that is why Zeus listens to him and wrecks Odysseus' ship.
There's a couple of instances, and there's also the kind of instance in the Iliad where Thetis has supplicated to Zeus and comes back to him and is like, "You owe me one."
Yep.
And this is kind of another example of like one of the very few times where you see Zeus kind of be like, okay, I will do this because you're kind of scaring the crap out of me with like, this is a legitimate threat to me. And I don't think there's a lot of people who can legitimately threaten Zeus and get away with it.
Right, yeah.
And this
not
is
more than
one
once
of those
anyway.
few times. It's wild. So I love that you brought that up. That's not necessarily something that I think I would have thought of as like, yeah, but the way that we have separated this up, that is an interesting little bookend to these two chapters. And so, yeah, this brings us, you know, full circle with Odysseus' story. So now we're back at Calypso's island, and
we're all caught up.
Arete and Alcinous are all caught up, and that is where book 12 ends.
If you could leave us with anything as we venture before we close out the episode, I guess, and venture on into the rest of the Odyssey, is there anything that you would, I guess, recommend that we keep an eye out for or keep in mind that would, I guess, enrich our reading experience? I could think of a few to mention, like with the Iliad, but like I don't know much about the Odyssey.
Sure. No, that's a good question. I think again, it's really looking at how Odysseus is equipped from all of the things that he goes through to take on the challenges that he finds at home. And even if it isn't explicit in the text, I think you can look at, okay, when he's interacting with, with these people, what is this reference back to? Where did he learn to do something like this? I think those are really interesting connections to make. Because
there are a ton of callbacks. You get these moments where you're like, wait a minute, I feel like I've heard this before. And that's because you have. Perhaps not explicitly or like really, really obviously, but you've definitely kind of heard this before. And so it's like the opposite of foreshadowing. It's like backshadowing.
Yeah. And then just have your tissues ready for when Odysseus meets his dog.
Yeah.
That's all I can say about that one.
Oh, I'm getting emotional about it already.
Just to tease how I respond to like when Odysseus finally meets his family members. I guess, as I mentioned before, like his meeting with his father is so much more emotional for me anyway than his meeting with Penelope. There's so much made for each other, but their love is weird, and they're both very weird people. But like the more human seeming relationship that Odysseus has with his father, I'll just say it, like when he approaches his father and does the whole like, oh, I'm actually this guy, and then he just breaks down. He's like, no, wait, it's me. That like just again, to get our heart out of ourselves. That's the part that just gets me. I can't wait to talk about it.
And that answers the question that sort of goes on and on, like how much can Odysseus lie and pretend and go through all of these things? How tough is he? And we find out with his dad, because eventually he cannot anymore.
But it's really interesting that like we kind of preface all of that with this torturous, like drawn out, convoluted journey where so much happens, and then it all kind of and you hit the zenith with him killing all the suitors, and there's like this sense of like almost an adrenaline crash after all of that happens.
Yeah, and there's still so much more to do.
Exactly.
It still feels like in those action movies where like the hero finally kills everyone that he needs to kill, and he just like sinks to the ground exhausted. It's like, oh,
exactly.
God.
You very much get that feeling.
It's that feeling.
Yeah.
Even though, as you said, there's still more to do. Which again,
right,
a bit down the line.
Yes, we will certainly get into that. But I really appreciate kind of these seeds that you've planted for us to kind of look out for, and want to thank you once again for joining us. This has been such an amazingly fun conversation, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love talking about all of this. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Would you like to plug anything real quick before we pass it off to Dr. Daniel?
Sure. You can follow me on all the social media at Norse Meat. It's Norse like Vikings, and meat like you eat for dinner, whatever. And then, my book, Naming Your Little Geek, is available everywhere books are sold. Technically, it's a baby name book, but you can use it for naming anything.
That's
your pets, your
amazing.
your Wi-Fi network, and yeah, it's your RPG characters.
Yes.
It's super fun, so you can check that out.
Excellent.
Awesome, and all of the socials will be listed in the description. So
indeed, they will.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here.
So on that note, we will wrap up, and as usual, we will throw it to Dr. Daniel to give us his thoughts and insights on everything that we just talked about, which was, again, just amazingly, amazingly fun, and we will see you all after that.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel, otherwise known as Dr. Daniel, Dr. Dan, or the Dancing Grad, and I'm here to offer some thoughts on Llama, Wriste, and Scott's excellent conversation about Odyssey books 11 and 12. First, in terms of a larger overall note, I really love Scott's point about pronunciation, and how pronunciation guides tend to be more misleading than not. The only quote-unquote objective metric that we might be able to use to learn how to pronounce these names would be pronunciation according to ancient Greek. However, even the system of pronunciation in ancient Greek is a modern invention. There were no recordings from ancient Greece to let us know how these individual letters or letter combinations were supposed to sound. So I very much appreciated Scott's point that as long as we know who we're talking about, then pronounce it however you want. We obviously can't say that Agamemnon is pronounced Achilles, and we cannot say that Patroclus is pronounced as Briseis. However, as long as we know who we're talking about, then we're on even ground. Next, another overall point relating to something that Wriste said about the tendency of these epics to spoil themselves. When we talk about the Homeric epics, we're not talking necessarily about fiction in the modern sense of the word, of a creator creating a brand new story out of whole cloth. The ancient bards were drawing on a shared well, a shared repository of myth and characters and situations that everyone in the audience would have been familiar with. So when everybody, from the creator to the audience, knows basic facts about these characters and these situations, it becomes less about the what that the story is going to tell you, and more about how it's going to tell those details to you. I liken it to the Spider-Man franchise. When it comes to Spider-Man, you have the archetype of Spider-Man, this person who gets bit by a radioactive spider and becomes a crime-fighting superhero. But the constellation of details and relationships that surround that character are unique to each telling of a Spider-Man story. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is different from Andrew Garfield's. Andrew Garfield's is different from Tom Holland's. Tom Holland's is different from the comics. So it's not going to be a surprise to the audience in the movie theater for Spider-Man No Way Home that they're going to be watching a superhero movie about a guy who gets bit by a radioactive spider. It's more about how that story unfolds and the little details that get added or removed or changed from previous versions of the story. Same thing with the Homeric epics. An ancient audience would have known that it took Odysseus a very long time to get home after the Trojan War. But how he got home and what happened during that time is what's really interesting about the Odyssey. Next, Scott pointed out early on how it's these books, 11 and 12, that scholars have pointed to as evincing a shift from the Iliadic world to the Odyssean world, namely because of the characters that show up that also showed up in the Iliad, like Agamemnon and Ajax. The cultural shift on a larger level is one that I see as shifting from ideas of individual in the Iliad towards community in the Odyssey. There are 2 points that I want to bring up in support of this idea. First, the name of Odysseus' mother, and second, the idea of nameless collectives. First, Odysseus' mother is named Anticlea, which derives from 2 different verbal roots. The first one is anti, which is a preposition in Greek that means instead of or in place of. The second part of her name is Clea, which shares a root with the word kleos, which has come up in this podcast many times by this point. It's that idea of glory that every battlefield warrior strives for as they fight in war. So the very name of Odysseus' mother quite literally means against Kleos, instead of Kleos. We're striving for different ideals in the Odyssey than we are in the Iliad. Although Odysseus definitely has that sort of heroic sense of Kleos, and that sort of individualistic drive to reinstall himself as the king in Ithaca, the story is no longer about individualistic acts on the battlefield, but about a man returning to his family, and a king returning to his community. The driving idea of the Odyssey is nostos, or homecoming, and homecoming implies a home that, in this case, is created from Telemachus and Penelope and the Ithacans. So the story here is nostos, or homecoming, and it's anti-Clea, or anti-Kleos. It's against Kleos. That's not the driving idea in this epic. Second, Llama pointed out how a lot of the figures in the Odyssey are kind of nameless, especially compared to counterparts in the Iliad. Two major ways that this shows up in the Odyssey are the group of suitors, of which only a few are actually mentioned by name, and the crew of Odysseus, many of whom die in Book 12. I think this encapsulates very neatly the movement from the individualism of the Iliad towards the collective community nature of the Odyssey. In the Iliad, individualistic warriors who are striving for Kleos can get names. In the Odyssey, however, the nameless nature of the individuals who make up these communities or collectives, namely the suitors or the crew, puts much more emphasis on those collective identities. I'm a suitor, or I'm a crewmate, as opposed to I'm Achilles or I'm Agamemnon. Again, I don't want to belabor this point, because there is still a lot of individualism that happens in the Odyssey, namely in the character of Odysseus. However, there is a very strong sense that something is shifting in culture, from the Kleos-driven nature of the Iliad towards the more communal nature of the Odyssey. Next, just a really quick personal note. Scott mentioned that Ajax is one of his absolute favorite characters, and I have to say, he's mine too. When I was in undergrad, I was actually a classics and a theater double major, and one of the first Greek tragedies that I ever read in translation was Sophocles' Ajax. Wriste summarized the story very well in the course of the podcast episode, and the play just really grabbed my attention in terms of its imagery, in terms of its themes, in terms of its characters. It actually formed the basis of my senior capstone project, in which, in my senior fall, I translated Sophocles' Ajax into a script for the stage, and then in my spring semester of senior year, I ended up designing and directing a production of it. It's a really cool read, and it sheds a lot of light on the reaction of Ajax to Odysseus here in this section of the Odyssey. Finally, Scott pointed out that books 11 and 12 are sort of bracketed or bookended by the sun. There's another really clever bracketing that I want to point out that really points out how Book 12 is not only the midpoint of the entire epic, but also kind of a natural stopping point and a transition to a new section of the story. All the way back at the very beginning of Book 1, in the very proem of the poem, we have a reference to this very episode, wherein the crew of Odysseus dies because of what they did to the cattle of the sun god Helios. In Emily Wilson's translation, starting around line 7, for there, the crew's own mistakes, they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. In the ancient Greek, auton gars fetaresin et hastaliesin olonto, nepioi hoi katabus huperionos eilioio eistion, autarotoisin aphela to nostimon hemar. They perished because of their own foolishness, the fools, who gobbled down the cattle of the sun god Helios, and he took away from them their day of homecoming. The end of Book 12 closes out Odysseus' story to the Phaeacians and sets him on the road that's finally going to bring him back home to Ithaca. So in addition to the bracketing of Books 11 and 12, the bracketing of Books 1 and 12 puts a neat end to this story before we move on into the next chapter. Alright, that's about all I have. Thank you for listening, and with that, I'm going to toss it back to Llama and Wriste.
Thank you once again, Dr. Daniel, for your time and insight. Always enjoy hearing what you have to say about our discussions, and thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. We hope you'll take the opportunity to read along with us, since there's plenty to love in these stories, and please keep an eye out for our follow-up episodes by following us on Twitter at Homer_bound, or wherever you happen to be listening to us now. We hope to see you in the next episode. See you then.